Okay, thanks everyone for your patience.
Excuse me,
Yes,
there's nothing on that screen over there.
yes, we are aware.
Okay.
If that's hard for
Yeah,
you,
can you give me, unless you want to call people out every time there's a motion, that's fine. I just-
okay, we'll do that. Yeah, we could keep fiddling with it, but
Okay.
since we're at 6.
If it's possible, you might be
you
able to
could
sit where
relocate to over
Floyd
there.
is, and then there's a screen right there. Maybe you
Oh,
and Floyd
that's
can,
Yeah.
Can
yeah,
you give me a second? Sorry.
swap places.
Yeah. I'm gonna get us going, but if anything happens, I'll make it. Okay, so I am going to call us to order at 6:06. And Vicky will be our minute taker. Mike, do you mind being a timekeeper?
Sure.
You have to pay very close attention. We don't have set times for anything right now, so it more just give me a look if we start to go sideways. Sound good?
I can do that, yes.
Okay, all right. Thanks everyone for being here. Do we have any public comment this evening? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to our action item, which is to approve the agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Kathy Apgar, and a second?
I'll second.
I have a discussion.
Toy?
So, just a note under the policies that we're looking at tonight, under the action item. I think it's 5C. So these are proof of warning, not for posting. They'd be, then they would be put on the agenda for adoption in the next meeting. So the term should be warned, not posted. Posted is kind of the very final thing you do
Yep,
after it's already been adopted.
okay.
So just posting should be warned.
Anyone with Robert's Rules expertise know if we can change that wording in the agenda and still take action? Or change that warrant language in the motion and still take action this evening?
I can amend my motion. It would be the easiest way to do it. If I amended my motion to say that we accept the agenda with the correction that posting an item 5C be changed to, what was it?
Proof for warning.
Approve for warning.
Approved for warning.
Okay,
I think that feels fair. I mean, it's warned as an action item. And the board has the authority to determine what action it wants to take on an action item. So
Yeah.
that doesn't feel like it's too much of a stretch.
We're actually doing the front end where it's going to be looked at even again. If this was sort of backwards, where this was the final action and we were messing with it somehow, that might be different in terms of the not unwarned language. You're catching my drift?
okay.
Clarify, to accept the agenda with the correction of agenda item 5C as a warning instead of a posting.
Not yet, because I have another change to the agenda. And so what I'm wondering is if we should state the motion to be approved the agenda with, and then with the suggested amendments. Is that, because my suggestion is that we move the discussion about annual meeting or annual meeting preparation, which is now under item 8, that I suggest we move that up to board management and governance item H. And so everything after that would just change its lettering. And
Right, the
this-
order in which they appear doesn't make as much difference as the content. So you have the right under Robert's Rules to change the order, but the content cannot be changed. So you can do that, Krista, without having to do a motion or an amendment.
Okay,
But the issue at the moment is we're approving the agenda, so.
right, so
Any
this is,
sort of minor changes to the agenda need to be approved at this point. What's moving an item in agenda is a change.
I think this is what we were moving toward with adding an action on our agenda to approve the agenda. So we could revisit whether we want to change how we do this at another time, but we had talked about having flexibility to move items if need be and getting that approval from the board before we do that. So following that protocol that we've been using, then I'm suggesting that we move annual meeting preparation under board management and governance. So the motion then would be to approve the agenda with that change and the change in the language of the approval for warning of policies.
Okay, I'm sorry, but I need somebody to read the whole motion through as you want it reflected in the minute. I think saying that change is not sufficient.
Okay. Kathy, did you understand all that? Do you want to
I absolutely do. I amend my motion. Or yes, my movement to accept the agenda as presented tonight with the 2 changes. Did you get the changes already?
First change is to change action item C to approve for warning. And the second change is to make annual meeting preparation the new item H under board management and governance.
Got it, thank you.
Okay,
And who seconded?
Kristen Toy. Okay. All those in favor of these changes to the agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
You opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, moving on to the consent agenda. May I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved, Steve.
And a second.
I'll second.
Okay, all those in favor of approving the consent agenda, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, moving on to executive limitations monitoring. We have 2 updates. One is the financial report. Does anybody have any questions or comments about that? Okay, hearing none, we have an update, the superintendent's report. Questions or comments about that?
I like them. I agree.
Thank you. Okay, moving down to board management and governance, we have an action to approve monitoring report 3.2, accountability of the superintendent. And this, as I said in the chair notes, was a monitoring report that we tabled at our last meeting. We had a discussion about it, but we did not approve it because it was lacking the note about whether or not we are in compliance. So Aaron Gipney, who made the report, changed that, and we're now putting it forward again for approval. So I need a motion to approve that, please.
I'll make that motion to approve that.
Sarah LaPearl, and a second.
I'll second.
Kristen Toy. One second, just want to get my worksheet up. Any discussion about the report? Okay, here are our questions. Is there sufficient evidence to indicate compliance with the whole policy? Yes or no?
No.
Is there any reason to doubt the integrity of the information presented? Okay. Having reviewed the report, does anything you've learned make you consider whether the policy itself should be amended or revised? And is the timing of this report appropriate? Okay, so all in favor of approving monitoring report 3.2, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, now we are down to item B, which is to take action to remove policy E6, capitalization of assets, to an administrative procedure. And a link to the policy is in the agenda. And before we discuss or remind folks why we're doing that, we just need a motion
So moved, Steve.
and a second.
I'll second. Sarah.
Okay. Steve, do you want to say anything about that?
Sure, so, this policy, I think, was originally, and Floyd can correct me, put into place to deal with some requirements from Visbit or somebody like that. That was a VSBA put out a recommended policy, which is actually under a different category. It's not under the E series, it's under the F series. It's pretty much similar language, but this basically deals with accounting practices, and there's some information in it that kind of has to be updated on a regular basis, and it's really sort of cumbersome for the board to have to be in the middle of this. And our practice has been that if it's not a mandated policy by the state, we're typically taking the VSBA policies and making them into administrative procedures unless there's some, unique circumstance. So it seemed as though rather than recategorizing this into the right location and trying to update the information, and then have to stay on top of that, this really ought to be made into an administrative procedure to follow our practice with other non-mandated policies.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions about that? Kathy?
I have a question, and I think it's page 2 or 3 at the top. It says annual depreciation will be charged in equal amounts over the estimated useful lives of all capital assets. Do we have currently, do we have any kind of a schedule of the capital assets?
We do.
Okay. And where would we find that?
I don't know if it's public facing. I mean, we would list capital assets in the annual report.
Or upon request.
Or, yeah, requests.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Well, hearing none. All those in favor of making policy F6 an administrative procedure, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. Moving right along. Our next action is to approve forewarning 2 additional policies. F3, options-based response to violent intruder drills, fire drills, and emergency preparedness. And C9, local wellness. And so before we discuss these, we need a motion.
Sure. Sarah.
You are just filling that role tonight, Ms. LaPearl. Thank you.
I'll second.
Okay. And I think, and Steve will correct me if I'm wrong, that this is our time to ask any questions we have about either of these. And that feedback will then be taken into consideration, and any adjustments made would be then presented to us at the next meeting before we vote to adopt.
Yes.
Yes. So,
And in terms of changes, I mean, the board needs to agree as a body to make whatever suggested changes. So if somebody has a suggestion, wants to amend the motion to change something in this, we all need to agree, move forward with that amendment. But that's how we would change it here in this meeting.
Sarah.
So I'm just gonna clarify, this is a new policy, or this is a,
Yeah, I was gonna actually clarify that. this was a policy we actually adopted last summer. It was mandated by the state.
You're
and
talking about
said-
F3.
F3,
Yeah.
sorry,
Yeah.
please adopt this as soon as possible. Which we did, and then they immediately revised it.
The
So
one that they had created,
the one that they created, yeah,
okay,
so,
so it's obsolete.
so the one that we passed this summer, I think June, would be replaced by this version of it. And I think this was to include some options to how folks were responding to drills. Patrick might be a little more familiar with the actual operational implication.
Yeah, and we have a procedure that we wrote to accompany this. And we can easily make the amendments in the procedure to account for the changes here. There's nothing super substantive. So yeah, this feels like just sort of a matter of fact kind of thing to do, and will allow us to continue with the procedures.
Can I just ask one follow-up? So is the language of this one was created by us or was also created by the state? And this is just kind of a reboot?
This is a reboot by the state.
Yeah, VSBA model policy, right? So
Yes.
it's-
And my only question was, there has been a procedure developed in response to this. That's posted on our website.
It's either, I've got to check and see, it either was recently just finalized or is about to be finalized, so I've got to check and see which side of that we're on, but it's effectively done, if it not completely done.
Okay.
So
Kevin,
this, so the administrative level procedures, how much detail do they go into and how much to make public our strategies and features and facilities, as opposed to there's a public layer, if you will, and then there's a unpublished scenario for each probably site or something, I guess.
So similar to the policy development process, so they kind of pretty quickly put together a policy that they asked everyone to adopt in June and then modified that policy. We had drafted some procedures to accompany the policy originally, and since then, some model procedures have been developed. So we then did a little bit of work to rework the procedure to line up with the model procedure. And so with some minor differences, we're essentially following the model procedure, which I think was scrutinized for what level of detail should or shouldn't be made public. What's important to note is, separate from the procedures about how we respond to this, we have a document that outlines in much greater detail. It's our emergency operations plan, or EOP, which is another part of the requirement that came out of the legislation that happened last spring. So we had already been working on that for a while, so I don't think that requirement's due for another year and a half or something, but ours is done and that has been shared with local first responders. So we have much more detailed documentation behind the procedures that isn't made public for those reasons you're talking about. So I think that balance of what's public facing versus what isn't, it's something we've been paying attention to, and I think we have the right balance. And, you know, there are going to be different opinions on that, I'm sure, but I think we're where we need to be.
so one of the things that I think this board might want to consider, there are right now, I don't know, would you say like 36 procedure, many different procedures for many different categories of things that need to be taken care of in the district, and they're all within the purview of the administration to develop. And one thing to think about as a board is, to what level might the board want some opportunity to see those? And in a way that's sustainable, since there are so many, but also are there some key criteria that we expect all procedures to follow, and maybe there's a way to kind of, every year pick a few from each category to look at with that lens. So we're giving the administration the latitude to develop the day-to-day operations as they see fit, but that we're having some eyes on the types of protocols that are being followed, and the fidelity with which they're followed. And that's not right now built into our monitoring calendar. And so it would be something to add. And again, there are so many that, you don't want it to be an onerous thing, and also for us to be getting into the weeds of exactly how things are done. But that is really how the work gets carried out. And I think it is important for us to have some idea.
Would that at times come out in the sort of monitoring report? I mean, so if I'm asking, are we in compliance with our policy, and it's dependent on a procedure?
Mhm.
It seems like it would be a perfect time to comment on the procedure
Mhm.
as part of that monitoring report. I'm just wondering if we need separable things to be pulled out, or whether those key ones are already linked to the policy that we're monitoring.
Well, I would say that this is a great discussion. It's a little bit outside of this action item.
Mhm.
But it should go on I believe it should go on the agenda as a broader discussion to help the PGC committee look at how we implement that. But I think we're kind of straying from the actual topic into something that's a more global issue.
I did have a more direct question on C9. if that works.
Okay, well, we're done with F3. You might want to do them
Sure. That works for me.
separately.
Okay, so then let's,
So this becomes a policy or a procedure? I'm
This is
confused
a,
right now.
it's just as it reads at the top.
Yep.
It's it's the board of directors policy.
Okay.
In it says that the administration has to develop procedures. And a lot of our policies do that. There's a requirement for a procedure. And I think the question that Krista's raising is, what level of scrutiny do we give that requirement in other policies, including this one?
so because this was one motion, how about we move to discussing C9 and then we can approve
Okay.
them together?
Sure.
Okay.
So somebody had a question?
Yeah, I just had a quick question, sort of a broad question, but I'm not nearly as familiar with the whole list of our policies as perhaps I should be, but this policy seems much more granular than many of the other policies that I've seen. There's like a lot of very specific requirements that it spells out that must be met within the district. And I worry about our ability to effectively monitor this policy. I don't know if we can rely on the administration to provide information about that speaks to each of these points, but there's dozens of very specific requirements. And I know that this is a model off of VSBA, but I'm just wondering how we would effectively monitor this once adopted.
Sure. So two things. One, this is a replacement for a policy that was similar to this, that was already in our books. The SBA took a stab at rewriting it just recently, but then AOE took a stab at rewriting it and VSBA decided to go with the AOE. So one thing that, VSBA, I think is a proponent of policy governance, but when it comes down to mandates from the state and state agencies, they don't really care. If they want a policy, then they want all the schools to adopt it. They're going to put as much detail in it as they want. So if we were to write this policy, I think you're right. I think we would provide probably more higher level goals and aspirations for this and allow there to be a procedure that followed it, that we didn't have to necessarily get into the weeds with. But this is not atypical of a state mandated policy. They often go into a level of detail that sort of contradicts the goals of policy governance. So
To
that's
that
why,
point, you probably wouldn't write this policy.
that's right.
Because as a policy governance board, typically you have your, in terms of directing the superintendent, which this sort of does. You have your ends policy and you have your executive limitations policies. You wouldn't have anything beyond that that directs the superintendent in a true policy governance environment. The only reason we have anything else is because they're required by the state.
And I mean, Katrina and Patrick can talk about how this is, how this is developed and how we're following it.
But it does raise to your other question, the monitoring process is designed to monitor the policy governance policies and executive limitations. There really isn't a mechanism for monitoring these other sort of more specific policies that are separate from the policy governance policies, which may be part of that bigger conversation.
It's
With
part of
the-
the bigger conversation, because
Oh,
we also, in writing new policies or even going through the list of older ones for updates and such, it may raise a question as whether or not we want to add some monitoring component to it. There are some administrative responsibilities in here to do at least internal monitoring, that things are happening, and that to conduct several types of updates and get community involvement. And so there's some requirements in here of the administration that at the moment, we don't have a mechanism for checking to see whether those things are being done. Other than the board really is able to at any time say, hey, look, we're curious.
awesome. That's super helpful clarification.
Anyone have any other thoughts or questions about C9? Go ahead, Kathy.
I was just looking, it would be really helpful when we get these if the pages are numbered. Because it's hard to keep track of where you're at when you start scrolling through multiples, especially. A question on goals for physical education and physical activity. The American Academy of Pediatrics is recommending that school children have at least 60 minutes or greater of physical activity every day. And as I read number 1, offer opportunities for students in grades K to 12 to participate in at least 30 minutes of physical activity within or outside of the school day. How do we guarantee that the children are getting at least that 30 minutes if it's outside of the school day? And I guess, aren't we responsible for ensuring that they get 30 minutes each day? I would be looking to, I guess, to strengthen this policy.
Kathy, where are you getting the 60 minutes from?
The American Academy of Pediatrics, it's their published guidelines. And here
Oh, it's
we're
something
meeting,
here.
this is simply saying 30 minutes, and AAP is saying 60 minutes or greater. But if we're saying 30 minutes of physical activity within or outside of the school day, we have no way of ensuring that our students get 30 minutes if it's outside of the school day. So I guess what I would love to see is that it says participate at least 30 minutes of physical activity within the school day and not worry about the outside hours. Because we have no control.
Maybe referring to co-curriculars.
Yes, Fred.
Well, the language says offer opportunities for students. It doesn't say provide 30 minutes.
That's correct. And what I'm requesting is that we strengthen this to make a commitment to get kids moving.
Liz? Thank you.
this feels like almost a piece of a strategic plan. So like a goal for our schools and directions we want to move towards and initiatives that we want to support. Um, so is there another place for this to live? Could it be a part of the strategic plan that the right, that's being worked on, reimagined, re-envisioned, redone? Could this be an element that's brought to that group? And what do we need to do with this? Are we expected to put it in board policies? Is this a detailed procedure for the district? What are our options in terms of approving um, or in terms of warning or not warning this or today? What are our options? Because I feel like I might vote differently on this than I'm voting on the first one that we looked at.
This is a mandated policy by the state. So it would be board policy. There
Okay,
are administrative procedures that are required by it, as follow-up. But the policy language itself is mandated by the state.
So if the policy
So-
language is mandated by the state, I'm sorry, Liz, I don't mean to cut you. Is there anything that says that we can't amend the policy language because it is our policy? It's not the state's policy. This is the Mausd's policy, correct?
I'm not completely sure about that. If we're being more stringent than the state, there's probably not an issue.
One of the things I think we need to be careful of, though, is I'm not sure we're the ones to determine the amount or way in which a particular, like, that physical education should play out. We can support. Trying to think of the best ways to articulate what's in my brain, but if we prescribe as a board, then we have to make sure that that is able to happen without knowing how that would happen. And so I think what's nice about this language is it says in at least 30 minutes. So, you know, we, through a strategic plan, that might be a goal to increase up to 60 minutes. But if we mandate a particular amount of time in any of the things we do, we need to know that that can be accomplished and what would be the unintended consequences or what would be the ripple effect of that. And so, and that's not usually the realm we live in on the board. You know, we're thinking more about ensuring all of our students have access to a robust, you know, physical education program. And then the detail level of that is for our administration to determine.
There's likely a good reason that the language is the way it is in terms of offer opportunities and at least 30 minutes to reflect the realities of working to implement this. I think we would definitely want to do an analysis if we were to say guarantee every kid gets 30 minutes. What's the trade-off? Unless we're adding time to the school day, which will have other implications, that means something's going to get rearranged and adjusted. And we want to understand what that is before there's something as strong as a policy that requires it. Maybe in the end, that's what happens, but at least to do it in an informed way that we can think through.
First, I've got another thought on
Yes.
this too. So, just thinking about this and how it spans grades K through 12. You know, I know that in high school, you get to a certain spot where you've already met your credits for physical education. So, I think that's another piece that we would have to kind of keep in mind that, opportunities are there, but, kind of to your point, how would we be ensuring that every kid is doing something to that effect?
And to piggyback on that too, it's a bell schedule, so they have
Right.
PE every other day
Exactly,
and not a recess like our youngers.
right.
So do we, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything else on this? Are folks comfortable with voting on this motion? Okay, so we are moving to approve the warning for policies F3 option-based response and C9 local wellness. All those in favor, please say aye.
I,
Any opposed?
Opposed?
Any abstentions? Okay. All right, we're moving on to item D, financial management questionnaire. We need a motion to authorize the board chair to sign this. I had a question about it, but I guess first, can I have a motion?
Yes, I approve, I will make a motion. Sarah from.
Okay, and a second?
I'll second, Kristen.
Okay. My question, Floyd, is the link to this management questionnaire is from last year. So is that just presented as an example? Or is this,
We updated this, I think it's a typo.
oh, okay. Gotcha. Thank you.
The typo at the bottom.
The date submitted.
Oh,
So with a new, do you want me to amend the motion to accept this, the new version with the current?
Yes,
date?
please.
Okay.
Did you get that, Vicky? Thank you.
Approve the board chair to sign
The
financial
updated,
management questionnaire with updated date.
Correct.
I think the update would be from 1/17/23 to be 1/17/24. I think the 117 is accurate, right, Floyd?
It is.
Any questions or comments about this?
Were you ever gonna get a cheat sheet?
Are you ever going to?
My yearly,
Yeah,
yeah, with this particular thing.
it's Kevin's
I
work.
get to make this, make the same comment at the career center meetings too. Everybody's like, what do you mean? I'm like, I don't know. Do you know what that means? Is it better yes or no? If there's a no, is there a reason why it's a no? Is that good? Is that bad?
And we have a finance committee now. Something that those folks should peek at, I don't know.
Sure.
Okay, well, for the moment. We're ready to vote? All right, all those in favor of authorizing the board chair to sign the financial management questionnaire, please say aye.
I,
I,
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. Moving on to the moment you've all been.
Dun, dun, dun.
Right.
Speak for yourself.
The budget. All right.
I will share my screen. And try and navigate you all through what has been a pretty wild few days here. Floyd and I've got a lot of quality time together. It's been nice.
the thing you don't need to- patient mark.
I know.
This changes.
I know. And then others go, no, no, no.
Find the right.
Is it going up here?
Yeah.
Which of the 10 versions?
Much this is a regular.
But to some degree.
That's part of it.
This is-
Yes.
There's that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's thinking.
You might hop onto the Zoom if you're gonna share the screen, Sarah. That
Yeah,
would be
that's a good idea.
Good
In
idea.
their comments. Okay.
I'm not good at that.
Or spin your chair around.
So,
We minimize the Zoom. up there.
yeah, but I did on my screen, but I always forget to do it on both screens. When we last talked budget, we had option A and option B. Option A was effectively a level service budget, which still had us tapping into the 5% cap and kept us under the 10% per student threshold. We were actually way under, we were under by 1.5% or something like that. Option B had us adding about $3.3 million. Still staying well under the 10% per student cap, so we don't trigger that review by that state committee. And had the exact same tax implications because we were still within the 5% cap. Through conversation, the decision was, well, let's add the 3.3 million because why wouldn't we? It gives us some capital money, it gives us some one-time funds, maybe to get consultants to help with a variety of things, like, so certainly money that could be put to really good use and address some needs that we have. Turns out, we're not the only ones in the state that had that idea. And now, with budgets getting closer to being completed and adopted, and in fact, many have been already, the impact on the state education funding is becoming clearer. We're hearing figures to the tune of $150 million that was unexpected, which has the potential to further cripple an already somewhat crippled financial situation that the state of Vermont faces. Most importantly, the impact would be felt across the state, including those districts that Act 127 was intended to try and help to achieve greater equity. So as a result, there's been a whole lot of push from folks at the state level to say Act 127 was not intended to help you address deferred capital maintenance. It was not intended to do anything but increase equity. And districts like us that were seeking to add money to do some other important and needed things, but not necessarily in the spirit of 127, were sort of in violation of what it was intended to do. And there's actually a hearing on Thursday at 1 o'clock of the Senate Education, House Education, House Ways and Means, and Senate Finance Committees, a joint sort of hearing for testimony from lots of different districts around the state to hear what the impact of this all is. The positioning from at least the chairs of the House Ways and Means and the Senate Finance is like, as of right now, you get to do this still. And we are going to have to look at what levers we might have available to us to respond accordingly. One thing that was mentioned was requiring any district that is taking advantage of the 5% cap to go before a 5% cap review board, who would then determine whether or not you're eligible to continue to receive that 5% cap.
Wait, wasn't that everybody?
No,
That's the
so
law.
not all districts are eligible for the 5% cap because they could increase their spending and not exceed a 5% tax rate increase.
We were.
We were. So even in our level service, we were at about an 8% increase. And so we would be capped at 5. When we added the 3.3 million, we up to 16 or 17% increase, but would still be capped at 5%. And some districts didn't trigger that 5%, so there's no cap that applies. So I think that's sufficient context for me to kind of dive into what will resurface as options A and options B. They're the same options, only with different implications now than when we last talked about those two options. Does that make sense? Do we need to clarify that context before we get deeper into some of the numbers and all that? Floyd, am I missing any key pieces? Is that
I think you're gonna have to, I think you will have to.
as we go? Yeah,
Yeah, I think I'm.
absolutely can as we go. Yeah, I just
think
wanted
I'm
to,
not prepared for my question.
okay. I guess the one other thing I'll add is I'm going to offer some written test. I can't attend on Thursday to offer testimony. I was asked to, but I have a different thing that I have to attend in Waterbury on that day. So I'm going to submit written testimony on behalf of MAUSD to kind of explain our situation. And frankly, I'm a little offended that the language was accusatory to districts that were looking to add money and work within the rules that were set. It isn't as though we were adding money just willy-nilly, like, boy, wouldn't it be nice to like, it was like, boy, wouldn't it be nice to put a new roof on Mount Abe or get a new electrical main system? Like, so it's very much connected to other conversations happening at the state with the future of the school, project, capital projects funding and just affordability of education in Vermont as a whole, and I'm gonna take advantage of.
I think it's also important to note that this is, the superintendents and the business managers have been messaging this since November, that this was the impact
Mhm.
and the race to the bottom effect that it created. And it's now in the window of warning budgets that we're now being told.
No, because I remember you mentioned that too. I mean, I remember
Mhm.
hearing that in October.
Sure.
Yeah.
The race
Lake
to zero.
Maury at
Yeah.
the,
Oh, right, yes.
Can
and
I
now it's suddenly done.
ask another quick question? Do we know what our neighbors have done in this scenario? And that would give me a little more info, like, if the rest of Addison County is doing the same thing as us, then I feel more confident about some roles, some decisions we make. If everybody's going a different route, I think we're kind of gonna be in potential trouble. So if you have any of that information along the way, that would be helpful.
It is unclear and in flux.
Okay, but they didn't have their meetings last night to make these calls.
Some did have meetings last week,
Okay.
and adopted budgets. And they're contemplating whether or not to warn a new meeting and undo what they did. And some of it is waiting to see what comes about from this testimony that's gonna be offered on Thursday. What more is gonna come from it, like, so it's very much in flux right now, and our window to warn is closing rapidly. I think we have to warn by the very end of the last week of January, maybe the very beginning of the first week of February. I'd have to go back and look at the calendar, but it's coming really close to be able to be within the not less than 30, not more than 40-day window to warn a vote next week. So yeah, the whole timing of the financial process is a
Follow
different
on to
conversation.
Sarah's question. Of course, this is the local scandal sheet had a big headline about Addison Central had big budgetary issues, so I don't think I read the article, but it gave me the sense that they would have been a full budget as opposed to a gap budget. Or maybe there was something else going on, but so it, even what's being presented, not officially, but out, being recorded.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the hard part is it's so complicated and the views are very different in different parts of the state. Like even within Addison County, Addison Central is in a little different place than Addison Northwest, and which is different than where we are. And I think that's the challenge from a state perspective to figure out, so what do you do with this when it's impacting so many in so different ways? And they're wrestling with it now. It's just the timing of the legislature coming back in January and when school districts have to adopt budgets is not ideal, we'll say. Because they're scrambling to undo something or correct something that was unintended from the last legislative session. They can't really do much until they actually come back into session in January, and we're nearing the end at that point, and that's exactly what we're caught in the middle of right now. There's one other thing I was gonna add, but I forgot where it is, so let's jump into the numbers. So. Whoops. So similar assumptions to before, same one classroom teacher at Moncton, 15.9% increase in healthcare premiums. Our LTW ADM, I don't know if that's rolling off your tongues yet, I'm getting there. Long-term weighted average daily membership, that's the new way we count kids now. From the last time we met, it went down and then came back up to almost exactly where it was before. So we're still at, I think it was 206.8 is the difference. I left it rounded at 207. Students more than what we anticipated when we presented to you in November. So that's still good news. We did use, I think I sent a message out to all of you when we got some information a couple of Fridays ago about a pretty significant drop in the yield. We've since gotten information that this whole district's adding money like we were talking about doing hasn't yet been calculated in terms of the yield drop. So
It's gonna get worse.
it's going to get worse, I think is the narrative there. That's my sense. Floyd, is that your takeaway as well?
There's no magic pill, yeah.
And so again, the budget both versions you see include nearly all the ESSER funded positions. The one position that is not accounted for still are the utility EAs. But not looking at any rifts still at this point. So option A is essentially the same spending proposal you saw in November. It is a level service budget. And what that looks like, similar to how it looked before. 37 million, so it's actually a 9% increase in spending, which is large, historically speaking. With our increased pupil count, it reflects a reduction of a little less than 1.5% per pupil. So very similar to what we saw in prior presentations. Just as you've seen in prior presentations, these are the anticipated tax impacts. So you can see what our current homestead tax rate is. So again, the homestead tax rate is before anything happens with CLA, which will be another conversation. That is very much related to this, but nothing we really control. So we're at $1.49, just under $1.50 right now. Without the cap, we're looking at $1.66, and with the cap, it's $1.57. So I made an attempt to share what that means in a little different way. So same, looking at our $1.49 now and the $1.66 that's projected without the cap. That's about a 17-cent increase on the tax rate, or 11%. But because of that cap, it's actually going to be a 7.5-cent increase, capped at a 5% increase. So the difference is, so this is where the story comes in, right? We are still, even with a level service budget, we're above 5% increase. If the action is taken to require any district that's utilizing that 5% cap to go before a review board, the risk in this version is if they say, yes, we're eligible, we get the 5%. If they say no, it's an 11% increase in taxes. We probably wouldn't find out until after the budget, for sure after the budget's warned, and probably after the budget's theoretically passed by voters. So the cat's out of the bag at that point. We don't have a mechanism for the taxpayers to vote it down if it's already passed, and you don't have a mechanism to come back. So it is either it's 5% or it's 11%. There's nothing you can do about it. And this group will decide that fate.
So we can't even explain that situation because we don't know if that situation will happen.
Correct.
And so if we can try to convince people that the budget we chose was the right budget, like with more money or even this one, and then it, because we're gonna get a 5% cap, and then they say, no, you don't get a 5% cap, that's still our fault. That's supposedly,
In the end, it's always our fault.
right? I
So,
don't really know what we're gonna do.
So I would just for that context, I would feel fairly comfortable going before a board
Level funded.
and saying this is a level
Yeah.
service budget.
Right.
We actually had 3.3 million and we took it out.
Yeah.
I feel that's defendable.
My question is, what would a board say? I mean, it seems like there's nothing fancy here.
Well-
What would,
It depends what they look at. They could look at our $2.2 million in capital improvement and capital or construction services, right? So they could say, you don't really need that. You could cut that out and not need this 5% cap. They could say, all those ESSER positions that you built in that you didn't have before COVID, you could take those out and you could not have to utilize this 5% cap. I don't think they would,
but
but those are the two things that maybe they would point to and scrutinize.
but there's precedence on the capital, there's the repair line, the renovation line, what do you want to call it?
Yeah.
I mean, we have increased it.
Yep,
But I
we've
mean,
been,
that line item's been in the budget, so I mean, there's rationale for that, been in there
I agree.
5 years or whatever.
Yep, Floyd and I have talked about that. We feel the same way that that's defendable.
And then the ESSER things, we determined that those needs are still within the district.
Mhm.
Yeah, so-
however, if we wanted to be conservative and not run the gauntlet, we would have to come up with 6%, 6.3% worth of savings.
Reduction.
I forget the exact number, but I think it's in the ballpark of $1 million that we would have to cut
How much?
to about $1 million
Mhm.
that we would have to cut to
Get the
bring
5%.
spending down to the actual 5%.
Mhm.
That doesn't get us under 5%. So we're actually paying the same amount as we would if we were given the 5% cap, but we don't run the risk of it potentially being 11%.
Mhm.
Do you know how many other, I guess this is sort of back to what Sarah was asking, but it seems like there are a number of school districts who are struggling even to just level fund. And so for
Level service.
level service.
So when I think about just so we're
Provide
in the
the
same
same,
language, right? So
you're
level
right.
services, we're same programming, same personnel, level funding is we don't spend any more than
Right.
the current fiscal year.
Okay, so it seems like we're not alone in we wouldn't be alone in presenting a budget that utilizes the cap, but that does not add in anything new.
Correct.
And so, given that, it seems, unlikely that they're gonna ding all of those districts for offering what they've been offering, knowing the level of need and all these other factors that are impacting the costs of budgets like healthcare. I think it's different when you start talking about the 3 million, but I don't know. I would just be really interested to know what the vibe is after Thursday's meeting. And if we're in good company, I think I would hate to see us try to just chip away at $1 million worth of things we need in an unlikely scenario, if that's what the vibe is.
Well, and just to keep in mind, right, that's our current gap, right? Is this 5% versus the 11%? Our 11% is our real. We have to, so this cap goes away. Even if we are found eligible, it's going to go away. So we're going to have to, over time, get down to a percentage that we think our taxpayers can actually support.
Or we can say, somebody's going to have to deal with healthcare. How about we frame it that way?
Mhm.
People-
Liz has her hand up. She wants to see
Sorry,
it.
Liz, thanks.
No, I've appreciated the way that we're all thinking about this right now, and I think one thing is that even with the extra that we were gonna put towards capital projects, that's can also be defended as responsible, as we don't have a bond and deferred maintenance has been frowned upon by the state, and we're not asking them to support it for us. We're looking to put it into our own budgets. And there's also the argument that in the long run, we are all going to pay for it. So even with the 5% cap, it's going to go into the yield and we're all going to pay the extra anyway, right? That huge number that they came up with that was beyond the anticipated amount, that the money has to be found somewhere. So I just think it's one way or the other. I think that we have been making responsible decisions, and we do understand that we have to pay for those decisions, with or without the cap. So
Well,
I
and what
think
you're touching
that
upon there, Liz, is the realities of a statewide education funding system. Because what we add to our budget is in fact, in a way, paid for by everyone in the state. Because it draws down the ed fund, and what draws on the ed fund changes what the yield is, and the yield impacts everybody's tax rate. And that's sort of the concern that has surfaced now statewide, seeing how many districts are looking to do this. The impact of $150 million, give or take, that isn't anticipated. And what that does to communities that thought they were going to see a gain from Act 127 that now have to sort of help pay for these budgets that people are inflating because they can, is creating the pressure and the struggle that they're trying to figure out how to respond to.
I'll just add another one, I thought, so 11.3% actually seems in the current climate somewhat conservative, right? So I think in the state of the state, and I think it's the Vermont Tax Department said it would be about 18.5% was their prediction overall. So again,
But that's post CLA, I think is what they're talking about.
okay, so this would put us,
There's more to come.
okay, because it might be useful then to see, like, at the very least, are we in the ballpark of their overall
Well,
prediction? Are we below?
Excellent segue.
Oh, perfect.
Thank you.
It'd be useful even when I'm terribly wrong. I like that.
So here's after CLA. So we have so for historical purposes, FY 23 tax rates after CLA, current FY 24 tax rates after CLA. And then in the yellow, we have FY 25 if it was not capped. And then in the purple, FY 25 with the cap. So if not for the cap, Bristol, for example, will be looking at with this, again, this is our better case scenario budget. Without the cap, Bristol will be looking at an increase in taxes of $464 per 100,000. $300,000 home, $1,300 increase in taxes.
Sorry.
We'll talk more about, so I'll plant this seed. With the cap, looking at $333 per 100,000. Of that $333, $89, just under $90 is a result of the spending decisions that we've made that produce this budget.
The rest is not.
The
in our
rest is
control.
because of the drop in CLA.
That's why I get so frustrated when we're expected to solve all the problems,
Mhm.
all the problems.
And so that story
And then we get a nasty.
holds true for all the other towns as well, that the vast majority of the increase is due to the drop in CLA.
And who's talking about that?
Starksville is a little
Everyone.
softer because it's still the same $89 of the 149.
How does the CLA
right.
get-
But Starksboro, if you remember, took the hit last
Oh,
year.
they got
Yeah.
clobbered last year, right?
So that's why theirs are softer this year.
You're left.
What's
How
that?
does the CLA get determined?
So the CLA is determined, so because we have a statewide funding system. And because it's based on property taxes, they have to equalize home values across the state. So the CLA is an attempt to equalize those.
Mm.
So they look at recent home sales. So when your CLA drops precipitously, as they have been, it is intended to reflect that home sales have been much higher in those areas than what the towns have them assessed at. So it tries to equalize it. So town municipalities don't have a CLA. Because your grand list in Bristol is your grand list in Bristol. You don't have to compare it to anybody else because Bristol generates taxes for Bristol. Because we're generating taxes for the state through the state funding, we have to equalize those home values so that communities that recently did a reappraisal are compared in a accurate way to towns that haven't done a reappraisal in so long. And so there are towns that are in the 50s
Yeah.
for their CLA. Which is like, when you get into the 80s, it's a problem. 70s are a big problem. When you get into the 80s, I think by statute, you are required to reassess. So, mid to upper 50s is pretty wild.
And
Kathy
so-
has her hand up. Go ahead, Kathy.
Patrick, New Haven is undergoing reappraisal this year, 2024. How does that affect the 2025 budget? When we would have already passed it, but it's got to have an impact, right?
Lincoln's in the same boat. Like, there are multiple towns that are in that process, and it's a matter of timing. Like, is it completed and submitted in whatever process that is to the right people in enough time for it to have an impact? So the answer is maybe.
I doubt it. They
Starksville,
told us it was a 2 or 3 year process.
Okay.
yeah, Starksville I just had a visit this fall.
So lots and lots of towns are looking to get reappraisals done, and guess what? That jams up all the people that do that work, and it's not gonna speed up anybody's timeline, so.
And it's really important to recognize that the CLA hit might change. So you might go from being valued at 0.8 of your current assessed to 1.0 of a much higher number. So you need to step back and look at it that your tax dollars are probably not going to drop because of a reappraisal.
Because the tax rate
Your
lowers,
tax
but your home value is
percentage
higher.
will drop on a bigger number, which is really all the CLA is doing,
Yeah,
is turning your value into a bigger number than what's in the town assessed value.
yeah, the CLA is supposed to act as a wash before or after reappraisal,
Right.
theoretically.
Correct.
It could
And
go the other way. I mean, the reappraisal could be so much higher than what their state is
Right. Well,
balancing
Lincoln
it out.
was at 107% here a couple of years ago.
Yeah,
So the takeaway here, right? So a $300,000 home in Bristol could expect their taxes to go up $1,000. We could cut $1 million and taxes will still go up $1,000. The only way for us to control that $1,000 is to cut considerably more than $1 million
That's
to
because
to impact our $89 of that and drive it down a bit.
It's actually not quite that rosy.
You know, I like to see things.
Well, the
have both.
reality is, that's if the yield holds where it is.
Right.
So if the yield drops, then your impact is going to be greater
Without the cap.
without.
The cap protects us from the yield dropping because the yield affects the homestead tax rate, which is before CLA. So right now, the cap applies, the yield can drop to 0 and we're still good.
Liz's hand is up.
Good.
Go
And I
ahead,
would
Liz.
just say that I would just say that this is really important for us to kind of help sink in and think about how to communicate this challenge. Our town even, to the best of my knowledge, is looking at about a 10% increase, just Bristol itself, on their numbers. So if we really can process this, say this is where we are, put this forward, and then it's not a, well, guess what could happen, or guess what might happen, or this is a predicted future. This is the reality of where we are right now and what's happening right now. And here are the hard and fast numbers, because this is the experience that we're having right now. This is what you're seeing on your tax bill this year. And I think that this is powerful, and hopefully guiding some of our community engagement and work moving forward for this next year. So I'm glad that we understand it and we're thinking about it. And I don't at all see us putting the pressure on your office right now or our schools to make a sudden impactful change to find that money at all. I don't think that's reasonable. And but I do think it's reasonable for us to, as a board and as a community, look at our choices moving forward and options that we have for impacting future budgets.
Thanks for that, Liz. And I would even extend that to, I mean, really what we're talking about, like we're looking at a sliver of a statewide challenge in finding a way for education to be affordable. Education in Vermont is currently not affordable. And a lot of what we're talking about right now is just kind of moving the shells around of this unaffordable situation. We're not actually tackling the unaffordability of education. And that's work that needs to happen. We've made some attempts locally to do that, in absence of support from the state. I don't see, and we obviously understand the challenges in trying to do that work. I don't see anything substantive happening without pretty strong state involvement, frankly.
What are our, how strong are our legislative advocates? I mean, do we have folks that you're part of the Champlain Valley Superintendent's Group and, yeah, I mean, this is like the time for advocacy and really trying to organize around demanding some systemic change.
So just so happens, we met as the Champlain Valley Superintendent's Group with legislators from the Champlain Valley yesterday.
Good.
And this was a topic of conversation. Again, this specifically, 127 and the 5% cap and who's doing what with it, just as we're talking about. But elevating it to when are we going to really talk about affordability in Vermont and what does that look like? And how's that connected to the school construction funding? And there are conversations starting in committees about that. It's nothing that will happen swiftly because it's a really big, complicated thing, but at least there's talk.
Sarah?
I'm just gonna say the other bad news on this. I don't think this is gonna pass. So then what do we do? So I'm just gonna, I think that's pretty, like, something we need to be really, really honest with ourselves about.
Mm.
That's a really hard thing to even convince people to understand what's going on. And then to say, oh, here you go. And I just don't see it happening. And maybe I'm not that optimistic, but none of this seems very optimistic, so I'm just
Well,
being
then-
realistic.
I mean, that's the challenge, right? So in our current situation, if the budget fails, we don't start impacting the actual impact of the budget until we've cut $1 million or $1.25 million. That gets us to the same exact, like we can put that same, we can cut $1 million, put the budget out, it's the exact same impact. Presumably people would then still say no, and we have to cut more. So we're to make a dent in that, we're probably pushing 2 million, maybe plus.
Well, certainly plus, yeah. I mean, go to a flat tax rate is more than 2.5 million less than current spending.
It's gonna have that.
Flat tax meaning
We don't increase
same
our
tax rate.
Same tax rate.
that we
So-
did last year.
Let's think about
But
that.
we
2.5
Still have the CLA
But 2.5 million less than current spending.
current.
This budget increases spending by 3 million. So now we're at 5.5 million to get to zero homestead tax rate. Still CLA, which would still be an increase in taxes.
Correct.
So, shall I move on?
Or did you say, what was the number to 2.5 million of the current spending?
2.5 million less than FY 24 spending. And because FY 25 adds 3 million-ish, we get to needing to cut 5.5 million from this proposed budget to have no change to the
Base.
homestead tax rate.
Basically.
So looking at this in a different way, FY 24 property tax rate, FY 25,
Can we back up for a sec?
sure.
So that's the extreme. I don't think voters would necessarily expect us to have a flat tax rate.
Right.
We've been passing budgets with a, single digit, some variety of a single digit increase the last couple of years. If we threw a dart at the wall and said, what would they stomach? I'm assuming that 333 would be somewhere in the vicinity of $60. That's what I remember seeing sort of in the past,
What do you mean?
Per 100,
for 100.
Oh, that is what it was this year.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
reverse engineering the question.
yeah, I'm just
Yeah.
saying,
Yeah.
if we were gonna try to put out a budget that everybody kind of would just fall asleep and pass, what would that look like?
How much would we have to cut?
Yeah,
Yep.
so it's obviously not 5.5.
Right.
But it's not 1.
Right.
Somewhere in between.
I think it's important to note in that type of an equation, if you look at slide 5, Patrick. The 2024 homestead tax rate, the second line.
My slides aren't numbered. Is this this
no,
one?
Okay, projected tax
Yeah.
rate. I can't see it, so I can see what I have.
149.91.
15957.
Yep.
All right, that's taking the current year's tax rate with the new current weighting, right?
Mhm.
So if we just left everything as it is in this current year, it's a 10-cent tax rate increase on what we're doing now. under the new weighting formula.
Sure.
Oh,
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah.
Yep.
so we inherited 10% before we even started anything.
Right.
Sure, yeah.
For spreading it out to the others.
The challenge is nobody actually paid that tax rate.
Right,
What they paid is the $1.49.
49.9, right.
Yep.
Story between the lines.
So essentially, same information, looking at it in a different way, that 46-cent increase without the cap in Bristol is a 25% increase in the post CLA tax rate. And then it's just under 25% in Moncton, 22 in New Haven, and 14% in Starksboro, again, because Starksboro took the bigger hit last year with the CLA. With the cap, it's an 18% increase in Bristol, essentially an 18% increase in Moncton, 15% in New Haven, and 7 3/4 almost in Starksboro. So looking at it for those who are income sensitized, using again the 2021 median, that's the most up-to-date median available for Addison County. With the 5% cap, the projected increase is still over 17.5%. Now that's 17.5% on a much lower number, right? So they're paying a relatively small fraction of what those who are not income sensitized pay. But still a big lift, 17.5%. Gets
Some
some
will be
attention.
more, some will be less. This is just a
Right.
snapshot at the median. And
Yep,
It's a decent carpet.
yep. So, option B, same thing, plus $3.3 million. Just as we talked about before. We talked about this message, but I'll reiterate. And I copied and pasted from the letter that the chairs of the Ways and Means and Senate Finance sent. We intend to have all districts that utilize the 5% threshold present their budgets to a reimagined tax rate review committee, and hope that more extreme measures are not needed this year. You each have a part to play in this work. I thought that was an important reminder of the context as we talk about option B. This used to be the option that we liked. I'm not sure it will be after tonight. So now we have that 3.3 million. So that's now a 19% increase. We're still under the 10%. If you recall, way back when, the target the board set was stay under that 10% increase per pupil. This budget meets that target. Would not trigger that 10% review, but now we know there might be a 5% review.
They should have said that.
There's-
It's ridiculous.
We could play the woulda,
You
coulda, shoulda
can't-
game.
you Just make up
Oh,
rules as
okay.
they go.
So same information here, only now the projected homestead without the cap would be $1.85. It was $1.67, I think. So that equates to now a 23% increase from 24. But again, capped at 5%. So now when we're talking about the risk, right? In terms of going before this 5% review committee, if that materializes. If they say yes, it's 5%. If they say no, it's 23.5% increase to the homestead tax rate before we've done anything with CLA. When we add CLA, the options are $700 per 100,000 increase in Bristol. So on that same $300,000 home, that would be $2,000, over $2,000 more in taxes. Or with the cap, that same 1,000 that we saw before.
When's their review?
Don't know.
How convenient.
They still have to, is it rulemaking or is it legislation?
Uncertain.
Well, I would guess, if there's $150 million bill on
Problem.
the table, that they're gonna do something.
And that's a loose guesstimate number, just to clarify that
Making or legislative.
there's
I
nothing
think-
hard about that number. But
I don't see how we can, given the saber rattling, go in with a straight face with, this option B.
it's just too risky is where I came to. You'll see my recommendation in a little bit, but it's too much of a gamble to
As
take.
soon as I read their letter.
Yeah.
Kathy, your hand was up. Is it still?
No, it's a new question. Patrick, what's our deadline here? How much time do we have before we have to adopt a budget and post it and start doing information on it?
Effectively the end of next week.
Oh, okay. We should all be in Montpelier tomorrow.
Yeah.
So again, looking at it a little differently, without the cap, it's a 38% increase, almost 39% in Bristol, 38%, 33%. And with the cap, it's the same as what you saw before, more in the 18% range. So again, it's just, I don't know how you bring information to the voters and say, well, if this and that and the other thing happens and we have to go before this committee that doesn't exist yet, and they say we can't get it, instead of 18% increase, then it's gonna be a 40% increase.
Okay.
Doesn't pass the straight face test.
We'll just tell them to hold the $3.5 million as a fund balance and give it back to them next year.
Right. And then we've created problems for every budget from that point forward. 70% increase in this scenario with the 5% cap for those that pay based on income sensitized, again, using the median.
With the 5% cap,
Mhm.
why does that change?
That's a
Um,
great question. You want me to dive into it?
Well, I don't want you to dive in. I want to put your toe in it because this
I'll
is
go
a deep
toe on it.
dive. If we go, this is
We have
an hour.
seen,
If we
Yeah,
go-
and we're at 7:30.
we have seen differing interpretation from the AOE in terms of whether or not the spending cap applies to the income sensitive side.
Yeah.
It does in terms of the homestead rate.
Oh.
This is the less optimistic view, and I think based on the conversation with AOE at 5:30 today, I think this is the right one.
So in your last slide of this,
The previous one,
yeah. I mean, that would also not have it. Oh, that's for the $3.5 million, sorry.
Right,
Never mind.
that's the big
Okay.
difference.
Yep.
I'm there now.
is that enough of a toe?
Yeah, I think so.
We're all at the bottom of the pool anyway, so.
So this
Where am I floating?
This slide summarizes what I shared earlier, that using that 5% cap, which again was the same in both scenarios. So using that as the sort of point of connection here. $243.10 of the $333 per 100,000 increase in Bristol is because of the COA change. 89.90 for each of the towns is a result of this spending plan.
So they gave us both problems at one time.
Well, there's much more than two
Well,
problems,
true,
but those
but-
are two big ones. So all that to say, I think it goes without saying now, my recommendation, option A. I think in the event that there is this 5% commission that we have to go before, we can defend a level service budget. We can talk about, the needs, et cetera. It would be hard to defend, although Liz makes a good point. In some ways, it would be easy to defend, given our capital needs. The response would be, Act 127 wasn't about fixing your roof. Act 127 was about equity, and you adding that 3.3 million while it gets you your roof doesn't help with the equity problem we were trying to solve. In fact, it exacerbates the equity problem.
If they have a 5% review committee, they might still point out
True.
that our current capital reserve and our current construction budget, go get yourself a bond.
I completely agree. Option A is definitely much more defendable than option B is, and there's still some risk. If this committee even materializes. Here's the other risk. We haven't really talked about this.
One other.
Yep.
Sorry. And how does the central office purchase fit into that?
It doesn't. So with the money that we have budgeted in option A, we would still be able to move forward with the central office.
No, but I'm saying that purchase also would be something that might scrutinize under 5%, because that's additional.
Well, we're using the money, it's the same conversation. We would be using the money in our
It's in our current.
construction
reserve.
services line, that 2.2 million
Mhm.
to purchase the building. So it isn't, we aren't adding money
Right.
to the budget to make that purchase. We are, instead of using money we have to make facilities upgrades, we'd be repurposing that to make the purchase.
But it is money we could reallocate programs and services
Yeah,
to
and
bring the budget down.
that would be true whether we were buying the building or putting money into
No, I
construction. So it's-
understand. I'm just saying it's.
Yeah, and I think
I'm playing I'm playing the committee right now.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, and we don't know the makeup of the committee. We wouldn't know who'd be on it. Individuals on that committee had different perspectives that they would be bringing in.
Or what level of detail I'd even get into.
Mhm.
The sticky part about the central office question is something, you gotta do something because we're gonna get kicked out of this building. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, no,
it doesn't matter.
One thing we haven't really talked about in terms of how this could all play out. Let's say there are 30 districts that were looking to do something like what we were in adding the 3.3 million. And if we make the decision not to spend that money, and the other 29 still spend it,
Right.
and this 5% review doesn't come through, we're paying for everyone else doing it without the benefit of the added money ourselves.
They better not do it.
So to that point, and to get us to deciding what our next steps are. First, let me just ask, is there more that you want to share with us before we
The,
determine what?
the only point I will say, at one point in time in my mind, I thought it might be wise to postpone adopting a budget until middle of next week to give the Thursday thing to the time to happen and see what might materialize from there and see if we have any more information. But as I've thought about it and Floyd's thought about it, and we've connected on our thoughts around it. The reality is adding that money does in fact go against what 127 is intending to do. And 127 has merit. Like if there's a good reason to be doing that work of creating greater equity in our schools. That's not going to change whether they have a 5% committee or don't have a 5% committee. It's not going to change the fact that there will be, it'll have a similar impact to 40 districts going out for a bond all at once. Which would have a devastating impact on the ed fund and just the financial viability of education in Vermont. So none of those actually most important things are going to change regardless of what happens in the next several days. Those will still be the truth. Given that, to me, the value of waiting diminishes greatly. So if they, best case scenario, they say, we will take no action and we will all just have to figure out how to pay for this somehow. I would probably still say not adding the 3.3 million is the way to go, given what we now understand. It's context specific, right? A month ago, when we thought 3.3 million being added was the right way to go, we had no idea the pervasiveness of that practice in the state. We now know that's very different. The scope of the impact that decision has is much clearer now. And this is us doing our part. And hopefully it doesn't come back to bite us and we're paying the price anyway and didn't get it.
Can you minimize or stop screen sharing so we
Sure.
can see the other folks? What I'm thinking about is maybe if we want to do a round robin to get everyone's thoughts about what the Patrick's and Floyd's recommendation is. So everyone gets a chance to share where they're at. And if you, maybe let's start with you, Mike. Get you
Sure.
right on the spot.
Yeah.
And if you're not ready, or
Yeah,
you can pass.
yeah, so I mean, I think I fully agree with the way it's been presented today. You know, the only two lingering thoughts I have are, you know, it would be really useful to have some concrete numbers to go to the community about our inability to cut our way out of this. I think the fact that we'll be kind of in line with the average increases, both in spending and then overall tax rate, is one way we might be able to message this, that that's what's happening everywhere. It's not just us, and that I think that'll be helpful in terms of getting a budget passed. But being able to show that there really isn't a viable alternative if we want to maintain the strength of the school district, I think it would be useful. And then the only other one is about sort of the intent of Act 127, and I know at some point we had talked about maybe allocating some of that extra money to address sort of DEI issues and sort of the conversations that the community has brought to us, which sounds like would be really in line with the goals of Act 127. And so not to throw mud in the water, but if that is the case, then there may be some standing to ask for some of that money to approach that rather than capital, right? And maybe that, I don't know how that shapes out, and maybe it's too risky to even go down that path. But if it's in the intent,
I've thought about that a little bit. We do have the benefit of an education reserve fund that is one-time money that could be used as we would have used the one-time money here. So there's a plan B to do some of those things that you just talked about that are not capital related.
perfect. So,
And the board has the authority to spend that money, so.
Okay.
And it could be warned for an action item, the board takes action, and we're gonna allocate $100,000 for a consultant on.
Sure. Whatever. Okay, so perfect. That addresses my lingering concern, I would say. Yeah.
Can I just ask a clarifying question, Mike? So you were saying, how do we share this with voters in a way that contextualizes? You're talking about the concern Sarah raised about the budget potentially not passing, even if we just present the recommendation that Patrick had.
Definitely, sort of the devil's advocate that Steve was playing,
Okay.
and Sarah's point as well. We're like, sure, we could propose a budget that's really, really absurdly low, and taxes would decrease, and we'd be heroes, except for there wouldn't be a student who could be educated. There'd be no teachers, there'd be no buildings. Like, if we got rid of all the school, like, to be absurd, right? But being able to show just how absurd that proposition is.
Yeah.
That's really not a solution, I think would be really helpful for us as a board in terms of being able to message why our hands and by extension, the voters' hands are sort of tied. That's certainly the impression that I get.
Yeah.
And if we can give them that impression and it's a truthful impression, then we've done all we can.
I want to respond to that one point and then go around and hear from other folks, just because I got a call from the chair of the Addison Central Board. No, Addison Northwest, who was like, oh gosh, what are we gonna do? And we've had conversations about shared messaging, and this just makes me think of, and we've had conversations with their superintendents, like how can we, this might be the time to really get our heads together around the state of the state, and that we're all in this together and we're all trying to figure out our way through, and how can we all support each other in our communities, so. Okay, Justin.
Yeah, I'm happy to move forward with Patrick and Floyd's recommendation. A lot of information to digest, and I feel like you guys have done your research. So,
Ongoing research.
I'm going to research, continued research, yeah.
See what tomorrow says.
Steve?
So I'm still trying to figure out how we could get, budget on the ballot that doesn't run a risk of having to be somehow act apart after it's voted in. Which sounds like it would cost $1 million to
Between 1 and 1.5.
get.
It's on the 1.5 or maybe a little higher with the new yield. And that's the unknown,
Right.
Right,
right? You know, we might cut that and still have a 7% increase with, as the yield races
we
down.
could, but the yield, the actual yield never comes out in time for the legislature to do anything about it.
Right.
So if we played the right game to the point where we got the vote, I'm not sure how they could come back to it and say, oh, you know, in May or June, the yield came in at, you know, rock bottom and now you're at 7 or 10 or whatever you're at. How could they point to you and say, hey, how come you're not below 5%? So I'm just trying to play out the scenario. Say we go with option A and this ad hoc committee shows up and says, yeah, no, I think you guys can scrape up 100, you know, $1.5 million. How do we execute that?
From a context standpoint, the members on the committee by statute are superintendents and business managers.
Mhm.
You're talking about the 10% committee.
Right.
There is no statute for the 5%.
You are correct. I misspoke.
And what is the timing on this 5% committee?
So
I
Steve,
don't
are
know if it's gonna
you,
exist. so.
are you suggesting that you might want to see a different option? Or that
I'm
you,
just, again, still noodling in my head, how we avoid backtracking, or if there really is even a risk of backtracking, because if this 5% committee is not gonna even get formulated till February
They might become a 7%.
or
Well,
March,
what's interesting,
how are they gonna be able to affect anybody's decision making?
presumably, if every district does what we're talking about doing and not adding that added money, then there would be no need for the 5% review committee,
Mhm.
because this
That's the problem.
unforeseen problem will have gone away.
Yeah,
So the threat might work out.
it's just hard for me to understand if they decided they didn't need that committee. I mean, they were asking for data collection, like, so you've already
It's
given them.
underway right now, yeah.
They've given us a hard date of Friday on what warrant budgets or assumed warrant budget will be.
With
for this Friday?
Right.
has to
This
be.
Friday.
With a request to try and get it done before Thursday, because they're meeting on Thursday.
Yeah,
So
I'm
then
just
get the date on
wondering-
Friday, yeah.
What is within the realm of possible for you to get to know how this will, because so the only thing I'm wondering is if, you know, you would propose we wait to hear more about how this meeting goes, to see if there's anything that comes out of that that would either make us feel like even the option A is risky, or make us feel like option A is, we're comfortable enough with the potential risks that might be there. That's like the only thing really we could know between now and when we have to warn the budget.
But they need our budget to
I
make
was
the
just gonna
decision.
say, they're
It's a
asking.
chicken
for-
egg thing.
Yeah,
So I
I think we have to give them something that we're working.
right, but I'm
Right.
saying we could meet,
Well, I
we could
think
have a
we
special
I
meeting
think we
next
wanna
week
give them
to warn
something
it.
that pokes them into a reaction. In other words, if we give them A,
Right, if they go, this isn't gonna fly, then we should re-meet and re-warn
it's
something.
more likely, as Patrick says, that B would provide more of a reaction from A would.
My sense is if, in terms of my getting direction from the board, so we have, because I think waiting doesn't really change anything if we're not talking about a different option. I think assuming we're going with A and sharing that information with the state and let them use that information for whatever they're going to use it for. The only other action I would see, if that is of concern to the board, would be to direct me to cut $2 million from option A.
Right.
So there's option A and there's A minus $2 million. And that would be the work I would do between now and any future meeting that you have sometime next week to consider that alternative. And I would want to get started on that a month ago.
Let's keep going around and see what other folks have
So
to say. Kevin?
So I think that we go with recommendation, which is option A, as I understand it, and go for a budget that we can justify as level service. The construction services line, I think we increased that a little bit this year, or intended to. That makes me a little
5%, I think.
nervous, as opposed to keeping that level funded, like, probably that's details, but I think we should go with level service. I think it's justifiable. I think it's something that can be explained reasonably. If we are the only ones that do it, we can hold our heads high for the exact reason that you brought out, that this was not the appropriate mechanism to do that with, and we chose not to. I think, I'm really fiscally conservative, you know, and I don't care about the increase because the voters have chosen to not investigate some
Legislation.
could be considered radical solutions for cost containment.
Yep.
And 75% of the stuff in the Levinson report has been passed off by voters as something they didn't want to do: consolidation of elementary schools, consolidations of districts. And the board is kind of passed off on consolidation of the realigning the junior high. That's where the money is going to start coming in from savings, in order to make budgets less severe. And if that has to be done by the state, which they probably have about as much appetite as individuals and towns do to do that, there's not going to be any reduction unless you start taking money out of services. So I think we need to defend that level service budget, and then people need to start doing some radical departures on making the hard decisions. If they don't like this thing that'll eventually become an 11% or 15% or whatever it is, year over year increase in their school taxes after the 5% goes away, some of the hard decisions that have been put aside need to come back. That's me.
Thank you. I'm gonna bump to the online crew and then come back down to the in-person. They're up right above you.
over here.
Kathy.
I think we're between a rock and a hard place. I spent the better part of Sunday canvassing New Haven to get signatures for my petition for reelection. And the message that was loud and clear from every household I visited was, we cannot afford more taxes. And when I was clear in return in saying, well, in order for us not to increase taxes because of the way the education in Vermont is funded, that means a significant cut in services. And is that really what you want to see? And it was about a 60-40 split, with yes, that's what we want to see, and 40% saying, well, what would it look like? And I don't have the answers to what it would look like. So Patrick, I'd love to see you do an option A. We know what option A is going to cost. What's an option A with 2 million? Minus 2 million. And then I would have an answer to my voters.
Thank you, Kathy. Liz.
Option A. I think for me, the biggest piece of it is the 10% increase coming from the changes in pupil weighting, the pupil weighting formula, Act 127. And yes, I think it's interesting when we talk about what it would look like to cut the 2 million. That conversation is challenging in that it could be from capital improvements, it could be from services, it could be from a number of areas. And I think that is something that would take a little more time to flush out um, in a way that we want to present that to the community, and almost feels like I certainly hope that the budget A passes, because I think that we could take some time and say, okay, well, what does it look like in these multiple different ways? What are multiple options? And just using the Nate Levinson report again, going back to it and relooking at it, like Kevin said, here's multiple ways that money could be saved. And then having a variety of options there for that, because I do think that no matter what you point to make the savings happen, somebody can point to something else and say, well, that's not necessary, this is necessary. And so there's a lot of personal prioritization around where the money would come from. And so there could be a gentle, kind of thoughtful way to reapproach that conversation with our community about different ways to save the money, because it's not just a one option conversation. And we've done so much work to create a system where there's input from multiple levels of our school community and the district to get input about that. So it would be great to have that conversation if we're allowed to by the budget passing. I hope we're allowed to have that conversation in a really constructive way, if that makes sense.
One little clarification, I've heard it a couple of times now from a couple of different folks. It's the Act 127, as Floyd mentioned before, is the starting point was a 10-cent increase, not a 10% increase. It's a slight difference, but
Sorry.
it's like a 6.5%. No, I've heard a couple of people mention it, so I just wanted to offer. So if when you're thinking about a 25% budget increase or a tax increase and thinking 10% of that is 127, it's not quite that. It's more like 6.5%.
6.5%. Thank you so much for that clarification. And I hope the rest of that kind of made sense in terms of future planning.
Makes sense. Erin. Hi there.
I'm sort of having trouble putting a fluid thought together, because not only are we balancing a budget and figuring all this tough stuff out, we're also in a negotiation phase of in a phase, and I am worried from multiple perspectives about all the variables and how they come together. Option A, I would agree, seems something more defendable than perhaps option B does, although I'm a little bit offended, like Patrick, that the note that came out from the state, when I read it at first, I double checked to see if it was addressed specifically to us, because it was so pointed. It felt very much like it was directed right to us, and I was concerned that was right to MAUSD. It wasn't, but I don't know if it's intended to be a scare tactic to sort of thwart a lot of people doing it, or if the intention really is to get to the crux of why so many people are leaning up against that threshold. But I'm sort of bummed that that's what we've come to. So I guess option A is where we're kind of stuck at, for right now.
Thank you. Kylie, welcome to the board. We're so glad you're here and totally understand if you're still trying to even figure out what the heck we're talking about. But if you have your head around any part of it or would like to ask a question or just share your thoughts, please do. And you're muted, just so you know.
Thank you. I appreciate the understanding. As everybody talks, it's even like more clear to me. There's this historical foundation that I just don't have yet, right? Like people referencing things, for example, the Levinson report. But just based on what I heard in December and tonight, I'm leaning towards option A.
Thank you. And I would say it will get easier to understand all of this as you go along, but every year there's a new challenge to understand. So, Sarah.
You want Kristen to know that?
Oh, Kristen. Yes. Oh my goodness.
Wow. I think Kathy nailed it. Rock in a hard place. There's just really no ideal scenario because we're just backed into a corner, really. I mean, so I'm inclined to also support option A. It's the least painful. I really feel that Krista, you made a good point in that, sort of, collaborating with our neighbors to figure out how do we, connect together as communities adjacent to say we are all in this same position, and to be able to communicate that effectively, thoughtfully to, our communities is going to be really, really important. Are you going to be at town meeting? It's just, I can see and I can already feel the heat coming from, everybody who, we could offer up a special meeting to say, here's what we're doing, this is why, and there's still gonna be people that are just, I didn't know about this thing. So just, kind of thinking in advance, like, I want to make sure that we're prepared for our individual town meetings because it's gonna be uncomfortable. But yeah, I think A is best case scenario.
Thank you.
Ready.
All right.
Okay, I'm gonna go with option A, 1, okay? 2, I think that I really agree with Kevin that we also do need to have a little bit of messaging about the fact about decisions we make, about some things we've known about for a long time financially, and also like even who you elect onto in the legislature and things like that do matter and people need to pay attention. I think we should be absolutely messaging with our neighbors if they're doing the same thing as us. If they are not, then I think we shouldn't be.
Yep.
To be really straight up. And so if they decide, I don't know what everybody decided, but if they decide to go this same kind of route as us, I think we should have a collective voice. So we in the finance committee have really tried to talk about how to communicate all of these different things, and it keeps being put off, and thank goodness, because it would be really hard to communicate something, mass produce it, and then have the message be absolutely wrong, which is what we would have done. Thank goodness we didn't do it. So we would like to have a message that we would create and that will communicate all of this in a format that will hit the airwaves, we'll say, and not be an in-person meeting, because at this point, I think it is gonna be about providing information about what it is we've eventually decided to do. We should not do that until all of these things kind of land a little more. Maybe not softly, but at least they come to a little bit of a landing, and I think we will know more after like next week. So I wouldn't count on that communication coming out, but I think that Mike and Brad and I feel pretty comfortable with the fact that that is, it's better, it's a voice that Mike can explain. And Mike has.
You have a voice.
But it is really important that we figure out the messaging and how we're gonna do it, and I also agree that I would like to potentially see not a massive amount of work, but I think if we need to pivot, we need to be ready for a minus 1.5 or whatever it is. So that we have that kind of sort of ready. I don't know that it needs to be public ready. I think that it needs to be, if you see the writing on the wall, it would feel really comfortable if I knew that you were gonna be like, we really need to meet again next Wednesday or something like that. I'm making that suggestion as a backup plan, so that if we have to pivot, we can pivot. And by pivot, I mean, I don't think we get to do B. I think
wasn't
we'd have
getting
to
that
do A
sense.
minus. Yeah. I'm very sad about this.
So it sounds like, you know, the majority of folks are good with your recommendation, but there were a couple requests for looking at or seeing what a 1.5 or, you know, in that range cut would look like if we needed to pivot. And so I guess what I'm wondering is if
You have to explain it. I mean,
Right.
I think
Yeah.
we need it also
Why
for
did we choose
explanatory
these?
purposes.
what I think we need to determine right now is, are we prepared to adopt the budget tonight with option A? And get some pulse taking after Thursday and be in communication with Patrick and Floyd to see if we need to convene again.
But I guess the
What
only
makes the
thing,
most sense?
the only thing I
from your
would
perspective?
look for, I would want something much stronger than a couple of people mentioning it to direct me to cut $2 million, because it will be the only thing I do between now and when we meet.
Okay.
So I don't want to do that without much more clarity from the board that that's a directive.
Okay.
Well,
So it would not be an exercise, so either that's going to be something we direct Patrick and his team to do now. Or we go with option A, and if the budget does not pass, we would be looking at that. So, go ahead, Kevin.
That's exactly what I was gonna, I don't think we wanna tip our hat publicly, and we're already doing it publicly, but. About, well, maybe we'll take a couple million out of there and see what it is. I think we need to go ahead, if we're gonna go ahead. I get the sense that most people are stomach going ahead with option A or the current recommendation or whatever it is. That's what we do. And the next conversation about a reduction has to happen if the budget doesn't pass. I think it's sequential. I don't think it's
Okay.
either or.
Is there a way to be able to explain anything that we're giving up? And just thinking about our messaging about, because we're still gonna get asked these questions. Why, like, what happened? Why didn't you cut? And so I guess I'm concerned with not being able to sort of say something other than the word services.
I mean, just to jump in, could
Yep.
we work just with Floyd to get just the numbers, not even
Oh,
where it would
yeah.
be cut from? I think that would be pretty trivial
Yeah,
to come up with, like, this is the number to get us to 5%.
okay,
Exactly. This is the number to get us to a 3%.
okay.
We
so
wouldn't
we'll
have
work
to,
on
we
that
wouldn't have
messaging.
to show where that would come from, which
Okay.
has to be I mean, that, it's just math there, I imagine.
Yeah,
And so we could pull those numbers, and then we could at least have that as a narrative. When we ultimately show the budget overall, individuals can see where we're spending that money.
Yep.
Right? This is where the 37 million is being spent into the broad categories.
Right.
And we're telling you it would cost us 5 million for your taxes not to go up. Where do you want, like, I think that that's fine rather than us having to do the legwork of cutting things that we think can't be cut
Okay.
in terms of a message.
Yeah,
Well,
that's my sense too, is that I don't think we want Patrick to spend the next week trying to figure out, you know, how many pencils to not order next year. I think we just want to know, we want to give people a sense of the magnitude of what we would need to do to give them, I don't think, a no increase tax.
Sure.
Something that would be in the same realm as we've seen over the last couple of years, 5 or 6% of, you know, of the post CLA. So
Right.
that's the
Right.
tricky part. And I know the yield may still surprise us later, but if you can back up from even the impact on the CLA to say, okay, we're only gonna give you a 5% increase on your CLA impacted number. That's probably that's probably in the 5 million range.
Yep.
Maybe more. Maybe more. So, but being able to give people that sense of scale in an informational session would be helpful, even if we say, we don't want to go there, we want to.
Right, I think the other thing is by providing level services, there is a certain opinion out there that we don't have the proper level of support for emotional issues. We don't have the proper level of support for kids that are unregulated. There's a lot of things out there that people complain about that we don't have the proper support for. So we're not looking, we don't have this fat budget to really cover everything that's expected to begin with. We're just looking at trying to keep things even keeled. And here's what the impact is when you do that.
And perhaps more directly to your question, Sarah, about if people ask, why are there no cuts at all? To me, the answer is you wouldn't feel any cuts until we got north of 1.5 million. So why cut 200,000?
Right.
It makes absolutely no difference to what you're gonna feel in your taxes. It's gonna have an impact on kids in some way, shape, or form. It's gonna have no impact on your taxes.
Okay.
So unless we're gonna cut 2 million, we might as well not cut anything.
That's kind of the thing I think needs to be explained.
Yeah.
Okay, let us. Did we make a motion to adopt this?
No.
Budget?
No,
Okay, we need a motion to adopt the FY 25 budget.
I'll move for that one.
Mike Dash,
you might want to make a motion of which budget.
FY 25,
No.
option
option A, okay.
Yeah.
I'll
We
second
should actually pick a number that way,
A, 37,
for the record, that'll be super clear.
Okay, what's,
And I can.
the one from the warning, the 37 million.
Yep.
$14,566.
That's the one.
Say that again, sorry.
Yeah, so I move that we adopt option A budget to the tune of $37,014,566. And no cents.
I got 2 cents.
I'll second that.
Appreciate that.
Okay, so Mike and Sarah. All right, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Opposed?
One opposed, Kathy. Any abstentions? Okay. So next we have an action item to approve the warning for the annual meeting, and this was sent under, you should have received that this afternoon in an email. There's 2. First is the annual meeting warning. Is that right? And then the second is the ballot. Okay, so if you look first at what the articles will read, the first 8 are related to our work. and voting in officers, and then Article 9 is the article related to the purchase of central office. And then Article 10 is the budget amount, which is conveniently inserted in there already.
I'll make a motion to approve the warning.
I'll second. Are the addresses remember last year we had like an address issue or something like that? Maybe it was a month.
Might have
in.
been, it might have been the year before.
Okay, I'm just.
I think we got that
checking.
corrected last year. Yeah, that was an issue. And I'll just add, part of the delay in getting this was we were waiting for an appraisal on the current central office building to have a really solid number, and that came in today. So this 1,230,000 is the appraised number. There we go.
Okay, so we have a motion by Steve, seconded by Kristen. All those in favor of approving the warning for the annual meeting, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, and next we have the ballot. And this is what it will look like for voters. And may I have a motion to approve the ballot?
So moved.
Kristen, and a second?
I'll second it. Sarah.
Questions, comments? Okay, all those in favor of approving the ballot, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Opposed?
Any abstentions? Okay, the motion carries.
Can I ask a question that is related to this, but not related to this?
Sure.
What is the date that people have to submit their, if they want to run for to be on the board?
Next Friday.
It's this Friday?
Next Friday.
The
at,
3rd.
29.
The 20,
Or-
I'm sorry, what?
I was told the 29th.
I think Moncton is the 29th.
Okay.
Kylie.
Thank you.
Kathy, when was New Haven?
New Haven was the 30th.
Okay, thank you.
Okey-dokey. Moving right along. All right, so next we have a discussion item. This is a follow-up for the race identity and inclusion conversation we had at our last board meeting. Patrick, I have something that I was hoping I could.
You adjusted the agenda.
Oh,
I thought you. had-
you're right. That's right.
Something
We
else.
did add
Right.
number
Annual meeting
H.
set for H.
That's right. Thank you. Okay, so before we do that, we are going to talk about the annual meeting. So, I just pull the ballot back up again. Or if you look at the warning that Jennifer sent for the annual meeting, that is essentially the agenda. There were a couple of things. So Patrick and I are going to meet tomorrow morning with Keegan Tierney, I believe,
Mhm.
who is he the Starksboro moderator? And he
Yeah.
is going to be our moderator for the annual meeting, and we're going to just walk through this agenda with him. I had a couple of questions. So you will not be present, Patrick. So this meeting is presided initially over usually by you. Will that be?
No, so the annual meeting will be presided over by the moderator.
But he's gonna be elected first.
But he was elected at the last annual meeting and he's elected until
Oh,
the
okay,
next
so he'll
successor.
start
So
right
he'll
off the
start.
bat.
It's the reorganization meeting that will follow this that I'll start because you won't have a chair at that point.
Right, that one I
So I'll be the
knew,
chair pro tem.
but I thought we had to vote in the moderator
No, so he's,
first, but he is already approved, so we
Correct.
don't have that on article.
So,
Well, we do, but
No, we have
it's,
So
to
he's-
do it.
yeah, so
we
he'll
have to
be,
do it.
yeah, so it'll be elected from that point forward.
Okay, so he can still call the meeting to order.
Mhm.
Gotcha. Okay,
And then if they elect, if a new moderator is elected, that moderator would take over effective immediately.
okay. And then, let's see, I don't know if this is on the warning, but I think last time I was looking at our notes from the last annual meeting. Keegan did a quick review of Robert's rules, so I think that's helpful. Folks agree, we'll do that again. Then we'll elect a clerk. And then Article 3, we're going to do a little bit differently. Is that on the?
Yep, co-treasurers. So in the past, we've elected a treasurer. And the reality is when the weight of that responsibility is on one person and they have to be available all the time to sign checks and make it so we can pay bills, inevitably there has to be a backup person. So in talking with our treasurer and the person who's been sort of doing the backup work for us, moving with co-treasurers was preferred. And that way there are two people, they're both elected, so it's above board, everybody knows who they are, and you know, they will manage their availability to make sure that one of them can be at the office when we need them to sign checks and pay the bills.
And so, when we get to the Article 4, which is establishing salaries for the different roles, were we going to propose that they just split the salary that was last year or do anything different here?
So I can share a little bit of information with you. And again, this can be brought up in conversation and community members may have ideas to share. But we've done just a little bit of homework to get a sense of what the current rate of pay is and how that stacks up. For what it's worth, as people are trying to figure out what to do with that. So give me half a second to find the right tab. Here we go. So just looking in our region in Addison County, MAUSD, Northwest, and Addison Central. So the various roles in MAUSD, the board chair is $2,400, Addison Northwest is $1,750, Addison Central is $1,200. Board vice chair in MAUSD is $1,200, Addison Northwest is $1,250, Addison Central is $1,200. A conversation had come up. Our practice has shifted to involve the vice chair a lot more than it historically had, and there's a lot of value to that. So thinking about whether increasing the vice chair up from what all members get is a worthy conversation. Board clerk in MAUSD gets $1,200, $1,250 in Addison Northwest, and $750 in Addison Central. Each board member in MAUSD is $1,200, Addison Northwest is $1,250, and Addison Central is $1,200, so pretty comparable there. The district clerk, and that's the clerk that's listed on the warning, so that's the clerk that gets elected in. It's currently Jennifer. We pay $1,200, Addison Northwest is $500, and we didn't get a number for Addison Central. Moderator for us gets $50, $150 for Addison Northwest, and $0 for Addison Central. And then the treasurer, we pay $7,200, $5,500 in Addison Northwest, and $5,000 in Addison Central. We have moved in order to, so we have a policy where we report each year on the percent of bills that get paid on time. To help us pay people in a timely manner, we've moved to asking the treasurer to come and sign checks weekly instead of every other week. So a consideration might be given to that. I don't know the frequency that Addison Northwest and Addison Central have their treasurers come in and do the work. But ours do a great job. They're very thorough, and now we're asking them to do it weekly. So perhaps going from 7,200 to 8,000, knowing it's going to be split between two people, is worth thinking about. But that's kind of where it stands right now.
So usually folks can make a motion from the floor or
It would be from the floor,
from the floor. Okay.
and that's voted on from the floor, so
Right.
that can be decided in the moment.
Okay.
And just a reminder that folks that are online can't vote. Only people that are in person can vote. You can be online and attend,
Mhm.
but you don't get to cast a vote.
And we can make a motion from the board or not? About things
Yeah,
like
so
the
you're,
salary?
you're community
Okay.
members, so.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. So how do we, so do we want to just kind of internalize that information and be thinking about it for the meeting? Do you want to share that with us?
Yeah, I can share this information with you for sure.
Yeah.
And you could have a conversation as a board about what you think makes sense, and that may be
Mhm.
helpful to the community in arriving at a decision. My experience has been that sometimes, like we have spent several minutes, maybe many minutes at times talking about
Yeah.
how much the moderator gets, whether it should be $50 or $100
Yeah.
or no dollars or like, so. I think support and some forethought on that might be shared could be welcomed by all.
So does anyone have anything on those numbers right now that you would like to support or suggest?
Does the
Something.
moderator currently feel like they're well funded?
I have no idea. They've done it once. I know the prior moderator felt like that was fine. She had done it for a long time, I think.
Mhm.
And it's one meeting a year for an hour
hour.
or two, so.
Yeah.
It's $50 an hour or $25 an hour, somewhere in that range, if you want to look at it that way. And some prep work ahead of time, and thinking about the agenda and preparing, but. It's not a lengthy agenda. It can be complicated sometimes, but.
Seems like the ones to think about are whether we increase the vice chair salary to reflect that that has become more of a supporting role to the chair than it had been in the past. Right now, that salary is the same as board member salaries. And then the other question is, do we divide the current treasurer's salary in half or increase it a little bit from 7,200 to 8 and then divide it in half?
And it probably won't exactly work out that way. It's gonna basically be,
Based on how much they
we'll
work.
divide it by the number of weeks and there'll be a weekly fee. So whoever comes that week to sign checks gets the money for that week. So it won't exactly be half probably, but
So the board chair is getting 24 now.
Mhm. And that looks
Regular member gets 12,
right.
correct.
so
I mean, I was
split
thinking,
the difference.
that's what I was thinking,
Vice
like,
chair.
yeah, 1,800.
Suppose the $8,000 uptick to the co-treasurers and.
And I'm assuming people are, like, there are people who've identified that they're running for these positions, like, there's not gonna be like a whole bunch of new people who show up
Well,
for co-treasurer.
I think we do
because-
So-
people,
That is not usually the problem, that there's so many people that show up that want these jobs that we have to pick for them. So usually we beat the bushes to make sure somebody's gonna show up and is willing to do the job.
and we think that is the case.
And I
Yes.
think we have that.
Okay, right, I only ask because the co-treasurer shift sort of presupposes
Right, that
two
they're,
certain people who can get along, who can figure out, like,
yes,
that there's a way of format, and as long as that's the case, then.
And we have two people that are willing and able, and I expect will be there. And that's not to say that others aren't welcome to show up too. The person and the salary get elected from the floor at that meeting.
How much time does the treasurer spend per week? Is there a rough estimate?
It probably varies, but Floyd's probably in the best position to estimate how much time a treasurer spends per week reviewing and writing checks and signing
A
checks.
good treasurer is there for a couple hours going through checks and checking it against what is being purchased. My view on the treasurer is they don't work for the district, they work for the board to make sure the district isn't doing anything that the board is not made aware of if there's anything questionable. We have an excellent treasurer who is very diligent and isn't just a walk in the door and sign checks. So having said that, it is between usually 2 hours plus weekly with checks. And in addition to that, if there's a check that needs to be cut out of cycle, they're there day of.
so are we pretty comfortable with this discussion and equipped enough to navigate the salary conversation at the annual meeting? Yes. Okay, the only other thing that I was wondering about is if we want to think in advance, when we get to Article 6, which is discuss the articles that will be voted on. And so in this case, it will be the central office purchase and the budget. And so I'm just wondering what info we as a board might want to highlight before that discussion and who would do that. I'm trying to remember if we traditionally specifically say anything, but I think it could be nice to provide that context for folks, so. Yeah.
Wait, you wanna have somebody explain that vote during the annual meeting? Is that what you're asking?
So. We don't usually do a budget presentation, correct? Remind me. Or does that?
No, I think we do usually do
Okay,
a
during that
budget
discussion, but-
presentation.
so during the discussion of that article.
Yeah, because I think that is also the informational meeting
Yeah, you're required to
for,
have it.
yeah, you're, that, so. our application.
Well, we'll do it.
Perfect.
Right, so the
Sorry.
public presentation that's already being prepared for a night
Yep.
off of this
Yes.
could be
We'll make it an in-person version.
Perfect. Okay. Anything else? that the-
No, well, yeah, and the other, I was gonna say, maybe in conjunction with Kevin in terms of the facilities component of
Right.
that.
Yes.
And we'd already sort of broached that subject, so.
Yep.
Yeah.
We'll just make sure that we iron that out before then.
And I'll be
Great.
present virtually and can help, and Floyd will be here and Katrina's gonna be there, so. Lots of resources available to help.
Yeah, great. Okay, anything else we should be thinking about for the annual meeting? Alrighty. We're getting through it, folks. We are getting it done. Okay, so next up, we have a discussion, a follow-up to the race identity and inclusion conversation we had in December. Now, I will share with you, if you could share this, your screen, who should I? email
Which me
this?
did you share it with?
I didn't share it with anybody
Okay.
yet, so who should I send it? to?
Zoom. You sent it to Zoom and Mausd. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so typically, the role of the board chair is to facilitate conversation and not necessarily to directly lead a conversation or a presentation. But I've only got a few meetings left, so I'm gonna use my executive power to be a little bit more of a leader here, especially because if you know me, you know this is a subject that's really important to me. And it's something that I know a lot about personally and do some work in professionally. So, we talked about making sure there is space on a future agenda to follow up on the public comment session and then the board conversation that we had in December, where community members came to us to talk about their desire to see an anti-racist curriculum in MAUSD. And so I wanted to first just remind us of what it is we, I think, as a district in our ends policy, when we talk about equity, what we're striving for. So if you could go to the next slide. So if you were at our annual retreat in August, you remember this slide, and I love it so much that I was excited to share it again. I recognize the tree looks a lot like the one in the Shel Silverstein book, The Giving Tree. And so the first upper left panel shows an example of inequality where you see the tree leaning toward just one of the two kids waiting for the apples to fall. And so only one has access to the apples. And then the panel just below that is an effort to equalize the access to the apples by providing both kids with a ladder. The same size ladder, placed the same distance away from the tree. But because the tree is still leaning one way, only one child can still access the apples. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that now each child has a ladder that's appropriately sized for their situation. And so they can both reach the apples and using tools that are designed specifically for them. But that last panel looks at what it would mean if we actually address the problem at its root, no pun intended, at its root cause, which is the fact that the tree itself is the reason why we need these different tools. If the tree were supported differently and made more straight, then we wouldn't need to have these specifically tailored tools that everyone could get what they needed. So I think that's a great example of what we as a board do when we think about the systems that support education in our district and thinking about how to achieve justice is really looking at, from a systems level, what can we do to offer equal access so that all of our students have the same ability to thrive and achieve academically, socially, physically, emotionally, in all the ways. So, if you go to the next slide, when I looked back at our minutes from our conversation in December, and what is cut off at the top, it says themes from our December board discussion. So there were a number of, really when we talked together, it was a lot of questions we all had. Questions like, what does it mean to have an anti-racist curriculum? What are we currently doing in our district? What's missing? What do best practices say we should be doing? How can we make this work more consistent district-wide? So if something's happening in Bristol, how can we see something similar happening across all of our schools? How can we engage people to help us with this work? Thinking about students, many of whom are already really passionate about equality and justice, community members. And then what is our role and what is the role of the administration in doing this work? Those were the themes I saw in our minutes, but I want to pause. Is there anything else that folks think came up that is not reflected in here? It seems like we captured it pretty well. Okay. So when we think about what we're currently doing, what's missing, what we should be doing, one way we can determine what's currently happening is by looking at data. And so there are lots, it's challenging to really ascertain whether your school is an anti-racist school. There are limits to how you can gauge that, and not great tools with which you can do that, especially in a really small state with a really small percentage of students from the BIPOC community. But we have a couple of different ways in our district and statewide that folks try to gauge whether there are gaps between the experiences of students from marginalized groups, including the BIPOC community, but also LGBTQ community, students with disabilities, to gauge whether there are gaps between the experiences of those students and the experience of other students. And so if you want to go to the next slide, this is something also that we looked at the retreat. Here we go. And we talked about the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. So this is a statewide survey. And the beauty of this survey is that you get to see the results 2 years after the fact. This administration, the 2021 data came out, I guess, was it this summer, Katrina, in August? But I think we can assume that a lot of this is probably still the case today, where this is students self-reporting their sense of physical safety and mental health. So you can see that students that identify as being in the LGBTQ plus community or as BIPOC or both report that they feel less safe, that they are more likely to be bullied, that they have more feelings of being sad or hopeless.
You can go online and see all of the answers to all of the questions also, if anybody is inclined. I was just raking through it today myself for a grant. It's very interesting, and there's comparison right between MAUSD and Vermont results.
Yeah.
It's a lot of data.
There's a lot of data. It's a great survey. And, you know, the problem that the reason why we look at it at a statewide level is because of the sample size being really small and identifiable. But so we are, you know, with all of the data, I think we're looking at themes and patterns and getting a sense of how well we're doing based on those themes. But you can, like Katrina said, look at our data along with the statewide information. So on the next slide, you can see something that's more school specific. And I'm sure Katrina and Patrick could talk a lot more about what the Panorama survey includes, and my limited knowledge is that it includes information both on things that are happening in the classroom and also in the school, climate and culture wise, but also in terms of teaching and academics. But there are a set of questions, I think there are 5 that relate to, that they categorize as being part of the student's sense of belonging. And this data that you had given me, Katrina, when was this?
That was
survey?
from our fall survey window, so it would have been September and November.
Okay. So those 5 questions are combined to give students a score on their proficiency. So how well they feel they have a sense of belonging. Proficiency is sort of a weird word, but you can see that in the middle school, about 50% of students reporting that they have that sense of belonging, and then that number drops off when you get into the high school and high school.
Is there any reason why it just goes off like a light switch like that?
That's a good question.
Well,
Why is
you've
there
got
such a big drop off?
Junior high is in the 50%, then it goes almost, well, just above a quarter when you, like, over the summer.
So did you guys talk about that at day to day at all? And do you have any like theories about that?
I
Could be
mean,
just the makeup of the cohort too.
we talk about a lot of things
Yeah.
related to a lot of the questions, and I wouldn't, the middle school, I don't have the data to show the percentage of kids we actually captured. That becomes a problem sometimes with the high school. The middle schoolers are a little bit more of a captive audience, so that we can kind of help them interpret the questions a little bit better. But yeah, I mean, your theories are as good as ours. Do you want to hear the questions? That might help kind of contextualize it.
That would be great.
So 5 questions. How well do people at your school understand you as a person? How connected do you feel to the adults at your school? How much respect do students in your school show you? How much do you matter to others at this school? And overall, how much do you feel like you belong at your school?
And for each of those questions, the students self-report on a Likert scale. And so when it's talking about proficiency here, it's suggesting that students are scoring on the positive side of that Likert scale. So it's not the same score from every student, but I don't think neutral is probably not captured here. This is only on the
Right, I went
positive
with-
side, right?
I went
Yeah.
proficient and above. Yeah.
Okay, and so the next slide is from our ends report. And if you recall, we see these, we look at, this is more focused on academics, specifically the ELA and math, and the graphs that are not shown above are looking at student performance based on whether you receive free or reduced, or you qualify for receiving free or reduced lunch, which is the best way we really have to gauge socioeconomic status. It's the most commonly used way to gauge socioeconomic status. And then this chart shows the significant gap in students who are receiving special education services and not, in terms of English language, arts, and math.
And just a heads up for next year's ends, the way we track students that are eligible for free reduced meals has changed substantially. So we can expect that to have some implication probably in what you see for data there. So there'll be kind of a,
Not an apples to apples, right? And that's also the case. This is not SBEC, right? And the year before was, or is this SBEC, but it's the last year that is SBEC?
You pulled this from the 2023 ENS report?
Yeah,
Yeah, that was the first year.
So
we
we got-
looked at that.
right. So I think, data has limits, and what is important to identify is that these are just one way to get a picture of what's happening in your schools, but they're commonly used measurements that folks look at, and that over time you can see whether there are changes in those gaps for kids who are from certain identity groups. And then,
Liz had their hand up. I don't
Oh,
know if
yeah.
they'll Take it now.
Liz?
It was just a quick question. Is there, and this might change with the new block funding for special education, right? is there a factor where you would be in a certain percentile in terms of your ELA or math outcomes in terms of identifying that you were to receive services, right? And you would not be receiving services if you were in a different, if you were meeting or exceeding the expectations, you would therefore not be receiving services. I wonder if that one chart is, does that question make any sense?
Does, and Beth can elaborate, Act 173 did change the way students are found eligible for special education. We used to use what was called a discrepancy model. So you had to show adverse effect. And one way you show adverse effect is a student scoring below their peers by a certain number of standard deviations. That's changed now. So now it's a response to intervention model that we use for eligibility. And I don't know, Beth, if you want to weigh in on that a little bit more, or how deep we want to go into that topic. That I'll just acknowledge that's a potential rabbit hole.
But these numbers get derived by literally students who have an individual education plan.
Right.
Thank
Okay,
you.
so let's go to the next slide. So what was interesting to me when I thought about the All Learners Network is kind of my assumption is that when you look at that previous slide and the significant gap in math, for example, between students who receive specialized education services and those who don't, my assumption is that our work with the All Learners Network is hugely about, closing that gap, and that's amazing. And that's a significant investment that we're making as a district. And, I think that most of us that got to see that presentation were, if not all of us, were pretty impressed by that work and would support that commitment. And when I was looking a little bit more on their website and looking at the ways that they work with schools, I hit the little drill down to get the description of the school and district math consultation for systems change. Because again, I'm all about like the systems. What are we doing system wide? And you can see here that really their work is about, a lot of the things we heard from Carly Epstein when she was here, which is coaching and training of teachers, providing, regular professional development, ongoing support for the whole team, centered around your needs. My assumption is that before they began their work, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that they probably did some sort of an audit of where we are currently and looked at our data and a sense of where people were at baseline before they determined how best to help us. Am I right?
I'm not 100% sure. Trina, you want to talk about
I
that?
don't know if audit would be the word I would use. The way in which we're being supported by Carly and also Kathleen now here at Mount Abe is really on pedagogy and actual instruction in the classroom.
Mhm.
We have enough of a support structure on the curriculum side in terms of the way we work with teachers during our early release days and the curriculum frameworks document we have in mathematics. And we do a lot of data analysis on our own. What we really wanted was actual pedagogical change in the classroom.
Mhm.
How can we make sure what you're doing via your curriculum and your program, Bridges or whatever it might be, is actually accessible to all the kids in your class.
Yeah.
So the coaches spend almost all of their time in classrooms with teachers,
Yeah.
really kind of co-teaching, model teaching, sitting with kids, showing them how you would ask questions, developing. Right now, we're really focusing heavily on math menu. So the teacher does their lunch, their mini lessons, is what Carly talked about. Math menu is that sort of independent work time or time you can be in small groups and really tailor how you can reinforce, reteach, or have a kid work on some skill gaps in the context of the classroom. That's how they're spending their time.
Yeah, and my guess is that to determine, like, there had to be some sense of where we are now, what folks already know. And then going in and building in all of that in classroom support and work.
Yeah, so Carly met with all the admins multiple times, did walkthroughs in all of the classrooms before she really started coaching.
Yeah.
I would say more of a hands-on
Yeah.
type audit, I guess, if you will, but certainly gained a lot of information in the field.
Great, okay. So if you go to the next slide, I'm queuing it up because I think this is where we want to go. But I think what you said, Katrina, about kind of a hands-on quote audit, I think number one, I hope we as a district can get to a place where what's happening with the All Learners Network in math is what's happening around race, identity, and inclusion. And that to do that well, you first really need to know where you are, and that means doing an assessment of an organization's climate and programs and practices and policies and procedures to really see what do we want to raise up, because there's a lot of great work that should be celebrated, and we know that that's happening already. And where are there gaps, and what is required to mitigate some of those gaps. And so if you can go to the next slide. Typically, the components of an equity audit include these different pieces. So I've had the opportunity to do equity audits or assessments in school districts and in other types of organizations. And you usually first try to identify an internal team that's going to be your champions for the work. And they know the organization well, and they include leaders and people from different stakeholder groups to really help identify what the goals are, to shape the process, to develop the follow-up actions and next steps. There's also a period of collecting data, and that data is more than just looking at SBEC scores or youth risk behavior data. It's a lot of thinking about how to connect with stakeholders to really learn from them. What is your current experience like? And those stakeholders might include staff. They might include students. They would include district leaders. They would include people at all levels of the organization to really get a sense of what's going well right now and where are the places where folks might need some more to move the needle in the equity and inclusion lens. A lot of times these assessments also include a document review. So looking at policies and procedures, things that are internal to the organization and things that are externally facing. And all of that review generates themes that are then coded and analyzed to identify areas where you might be able to pull out places that are that there are gaps and develop action plans. And so similar to the All Learners Network, a lot of times those action plans include leadership coaching, targeted training, professional development. They might also include looking at policies, refining and revising policies. Any questions about what that work looks like or anything I just said?
So are we doing this now, or is it?
No.
This is a format to do something?
Yeah. So if you go to the next slide. This is where I get directive. So I think that our role is to empower our administration, that we wouldn't do this work, but we would empower administration to identify a consultant or consultants to do this work, just like the All Learners Network. I think our role would be to say, we support the spending of one-time money to roll out a several-year plan, because you can't do this work in just 1 year in order for it to be sustainable. I think that it could be. It doesn't mean that the work that is already happening should stop. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a book club that talks about how to raise anti-racist kids. It doesn't mean that those things shouldn't happen. But if you only do those specific things, they might not happen when that teacher isn't in the classroom anymore, or when that administrator is no longer there. They don't have that same longevity and sustainability that I think we're trying to build with the All Learners Network. So to really do this well, I suggest that we support the work to have a several-year plan, and that the role of the board is to then build in opportunities to check in on how it's going. And also participate in that assessment. An audit might include interviews with board members or other volunteers. It might include looking at board policies. So to me, thinking about the questions that were generated out of our hearing from the community lends itself really well to a process like this that would help us to determine some answers and to identify some concrete next steps. And I would just say that I will not be here to see this work roll out, but I hope that it does. It's been something that I've been really hoping for a long time. And I think there's momentum and I think it's really important. So.
A critical aspect of this for me, and this was one of the takeaways from the meeting in December too, I think was, I think the school leading it and the school has a large role to play. And we'd be missing opportunities if there wasn't an aspect of this, even if we're paying for the consultant to work with our community as well. To help really think about what is the work that we need to do, school and larger community to make some change.
Krista, can I just add a little note, sort of tangential?
Hang on one second. I just want to,
sharing.
yeah, we're gonna stop sharing so we can see you. Okay. Go ahead.
I went to the Bristol Elementary School's celebration of learning this morning, and I was really happy to see Principal Boynton was talking about the book that the whole school read about race and inclusion, and asking kids to think as a large group about what they learned from that book and continuing to promote that. So, you know, to Patrick's point about the school being included, you know, if we're already seeing that sort of work taking place, it's really promising in terms of continuing to move forward.
Thank you. Liz and then Sarah.
I'm excited about this work. I do support us using some one-time money to get this work going. I'm excited to see what we come up with and raising awareness, what we're already doing. Like Beth at the last meeting had talked about getting together a list of what's already happening in our schools right now. And I think that could go a long way. And also realizing that part of what we had set aside that one-time money for, when I remember us talking about it, was thinking, okay, if we hit a cliff at some point in our spending, we might need this to sustain some services at some point. And so I would, I think, encourage us to think about this work as ultimately being a way, much like the All Learners Network. I really appreciate you drawing that connection, because I think that this is a way to ultimately help all of our students access their education. The sense of belonging, the sense of community building, doing this work district-wide, and maybe with a neighboring district to help build our sense of community beyond our town lines, could be really powerful and helping all of our students access their education. So I do think that's a service on behalf of our students that is very valuable. So thank you for bringing this up tonight. And you have always advocated for students to, every student have access to education. I really have appreciated that about you from day one, the whole time you've been here, and that's been seen and heard. Thank you, Krista.
Thanks. Sarah.
Yeah, I would actually echo that too. I just wanted to say good job for using your voice while you have a chance in this format. And I also,
There's always public comment later.
right.
You'll have your voice still.
Right. Now I'm gonna forget what I was gonna say. I want us to be also careful about when we go into these things with, you know, I did a lot of listening last time. I have to do a lot of this also for my work. But I'm typically in a little bit more of a private facilitated session. And so I didn't feel like it was always appropriate or comfortable for everybody to speak last time. And I just like to make sure that that's heard.
Yeah.
Because there's kind of an expectation of one voice in those discussions. And so you have to be really careful. And so I just, as a whole, as a board going forward, having the conversations, I think they need to be set up a little bit differently. Secondly, there were also a lot of comments about like certain, you know, language being said or whatever. And so when we're assessing ourselves or monitoring ourselves, well, I think we need to be really careful about what we're actually assessing. Are we assessing our response to it? Are we assessing that it happens? Because that, I think there's way too much that comes, as we see, on the schools and education in general. And that is our responsibility to like prevent any of this from happening. And it's frankly impossible. And so I think we need to be really, really clear going forward when we're looking at policies and procedures and all of those types of things about what it is we're actually, like with policy governance, what it is we actually have control over and can hold ourselves accountable for. And so while I understand the system, when things don't go well, I think we need to find a way to show all these things that we're doing. And I don't know, I guess trying to have my last voice too. Anyway, thank you for your work.
You go.
I think that there's certainly nothing. This is good. It's good. And I think it's much broader based, and I think it would kick a whole lot more tires. I think it would be much more thorough looking at diversity, race, and inclusion. However, the people that showed up the December meeting, whatever it was, I think they were very narrow focused. And I'm not so sure broad-based program like this is going to solve what their focus is. And I think, Patrick, when you said it's key to have community involvement in this, it becomes very important. From my perspective, is to get the view widened out, if you will, and make sure that there are other aspects of, you know, discrimination, whatever form it may be in, reflected and worked on, as opposed to the narrow scope that they were presenting.
Yeah, two things. One, to your point, Sarah, I think a good consultant would set up the conditions for a conversation that would allow for more. No, that was a hard, yes. And to your point, I think that they would also be really mindful of the value of community engagement and the importance of the broad perspective. And I also think that they would guide the best approach to this, regardless of several, you know, voices in the choir. And I think that in my experience and from my learning, when you set equitable systems up, keeping in mind the folks that are most marginalized, everybody benefits. So I think that in the end, the most inclusive policy is the one that is keeping the most marginalized folks in mind. Anyway. But that's why you have a consultant that is an expert that can get that credibility and that access and hopefully extract a little bit away from the entanglement of the community.
It's a good idea.
What's that?
It's a good idea. it's also nice to not direct everybody who's already working really hard an additional task that is, would be very, very, very challenging to like take on. It's better to have an outside view, and it's better to have it just be a paid thing. That we put our money, it's neutral, and we put our
Yeah.
money towards it.
Yeah.
And we have a fund that is helpful for that, and so good
Yeah.
call with the choice of that.
I think you do have a component of this already set up though with your advisory group. I mean, the SEL focus they have is pretty closely related to this, I would think. Especially in terms of sense of belonging and,
Are you talking about the superintendent?
Yeah, the
Council?
advisory council, yeah.
yeah. I mean, if you're looking for a team to sync up with,
Mhm.
um,
Well, the timing likely wouldn't be ideal, but that advisory council right now is kind of working through creating a revised strategic plan. We can lean on a lot of what's in the current plan, given the hiccups we've had with the global pandemics and such. But a question that we're gonna have to really wrestle with is what's the best way to infuse this work into that plan as a standalone sort of pillar of the plan? Or is it a component of every aspect of the plan? And there are pros and cons to each, even that kind of, even some support in thinking about how we approach that. would be useful.
and where to find the dollars. Since we're so flush at the moment.
We do have that reserve account, which is a wonderful thing.
Okay, so unless there's nothing else on that, we have committee updates next.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
So is your intent to potentially add this as an agenda item going in the future, or like in February, or is this for the work of a future board?
I guess that's a really good question, and I started to think about, well, what's next from the board's perspective. As I was thinking about tonight, and the only thing I could think of is, I guess, maybe we need an action item in a future meeting to do that empowerment. I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
It seems like we all need to probably weigh in to say this is important. We like that framework. Now you go figure out when and how.
Or at least come back with.
And when you come
Here's how
back,
much it's gonna cost and here's what's available.
Right.
here's-
and will you authorize spending the reserve account if that's necessary to make it happen?
And I don't
That
know
would be
if
a
you,
board action.
right, so yeah, I guess it makes sense to have that as maybe a February agenda.
So if you have a consultant sort of ready to go, or a certain fee type of, is that what we're saying? But like somebody, like, this is what it would cost,
I mean,
a
I think
ballpark.
it seems to me like they would need to write an RFP and put it out and see who responded.
We might want to find out how the vote goes.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe March anyway, because with the February meeting is, we start with the annual meeting and then we have usually an abbreviated business meeting following.
Yeah.
This may be a meaty topic for an abbreviated meeting.
Yeah.
I think just for me on this, like I would benefit from a little more discussion of what kind of framework we're sort of envisioning as a board.
Yeah.
I like the parallel with the All Learners Network for many reasons, but I also worry about that. I mean, in that sense, there's a very clear targeted intervention, right? Where we have a very clear outcome and goal in this case, and a very clear part of the system. Every student gets math instruction where those efforts can be targeted. Whereas this kind of work is much broader, right? We don't already have systems and structures in place that we could neatly fit the work of the consultant or the recommendation of the consultant into this 30-minute block for every student each day. And as a result, I imagine that you could get a whole bunch of different consultants that give rise to a whole bunch of different frameworks for how to best address this really important issue. And I don't know whether it's the role of the board to sort of help pick and choose between what frameworks we think would make the most sense, but without that, I don't know what kind of recommendation we're giving other than fix it somehow. Did that make
Well,
sense?
I appreciated the way I thought you were trying to frame it, Krista, in terms of empowering, because I think that you get into that sort of tricky place of, you know, if the board decides to hire a consultant to do this work,
We own it.
then the board owns it, and I don't think you want to own it. So crafting it in such a way that you're, you know, directing / supporting the superintendent in tackling this important work is a better position for the board to be in for lots of reasons. And I'm certainly hearing that message, and where my mind is going is going back and working with the folks that we do have that are, you know, leading some of this work right now and thinking about what do we want, and what does it look like, and who are some consultants, like we can do that legwork and we can drive that, knowing that the board role will be perhaps through the ends monitoring, perhaps there are other mechanisms to monitor how's it going. And it might be authorizing, accessing some funds to support doing. I think that's probably, that keeps the board in the position that they're best suited for.
And just a reminder, in the vein of information sharing, we already were planning to come to the board in April to dig deeper into the panorama survey for you. Seeing as we will be including that in the ends monitoring report next fall for the first time. So we have a team that can come and kind of help walk through more of those data sets than we shared tonight. And in that same meeting, we also would like to give you a sense of our curriculum, which is the transferable skills. So K through 12 is created. There's work to be done. Next year, the K-6, the elementary schools will be utilizing that framework in their curriculum, but we also have something called a second step curriculum. So we can give you some sense of those foundational pieces that we do have outside of sort of the more activity based that Krista was talking about and Aaron highlighted, which is also amazing. I do also think that there are some of our staff is attending, correct me if I'm wrong, Krista, the next community engagement committee meeting. So Julie Pettis, who is our social emotional learning coordinator, and I think Aaron Tebow, and now I talked to Ann McKinney about that. She'd like to join as well. Awesome. So they can give a little bit more insight into some of the happenings.
Yeah, and the only thing I would just add to one of your points, Mike, is that I think, to my mind, doing an assessment of the whole organization means it's not just a curriculum that would happen in class with students. It's about the whole kit and caboodle. So hiring and retention of teachers, how we roll out different policies, facilities. So it's folks here were asking for an anti-racist curriculum. This is really about our whole organization and looking at it through an anti-racist, equitable, and inclusive lens. And then out of that review would be recommendations that would be developed. And it really would be, it should be done with an internal team of folks who know what's already happening on the ground, who know what the capacity of the organization is, who have a sense of then, are there places in the school day where students get 30 minutes of instruction on this, or would it roll out better in this way? So I think the first piece is identifying somebody to help do that assessment.
Yeah, I think I understand it better. I like that. You know, my hesitation still perhaps is if the call to us was a call to action.
Mhm.
And our response is, we're gonna study this for a multi-year project
Mhm.
to figure out what we can do.
Mhm.
I don't know if that's a satisfying response.
Mhm.
It's maybe the prudent response.
Mhm.
I think it might even be I think it's the right path, frankly, at a
Mhm.
personal level. But if you then have to go back to students who are in school right now and say,
Mhm.
I'm sorry, it's gonna take us 3 years
Mhm.
or 2 years or whatever the time frame is.
Yeah.
Before we even know what the problem is.
It might not take that long.
I know.
Well,
yeah.
and what I said too was, I don't think that means things that aren't already happening should
Yes.
stop. And there's a bubbling up of folks wanting to do more, and that should be thoroughly encouraged. And I love the participation that's already happened at the community engagement committee. We had some of those folks come, and things are still hopefully going to continue. And the more people that are in the system that are getting on board, like like Julie or Aaron, the more likely those things, like I loved hearing that the principal at Bristol was talking about the book that they're all reading. So I think that is responsive to the moment. And also for that to sustain this other thing.
Totally. I mean, I think it's just a matter of pitching it as sort of long-term goals and,
Yep.
and short-term goals and
Yep.
making sure that we express that we're interested in both.
Yeah.
Right. And that this is a really important long-term.
Yeah.
Goal while we do the short-term goals that we're continuing to do. And so there,
Mhm.
you know, I think in the question of what are we doing now?
Mhm.
Really being able to pull out specific examples like Aaron has and others have, that we can report back
Yep.
to those community members and say, look,
Yeah.
it's not that we're not doing anything right now. This is the range of things that are happening right now. And we have this really wonderful long-term vision about how we can sustain and really build upon what are really good intentioned efforts, but maybe not systemic efforts.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think if that becomes the message, I think that becomes.
It's an election year too, like people really have to be open to, I think, that the election year does a lot. And so it'd be hard to have appropriate language and things like that happening especially with young kids that just hear things at home and repeat it, and then I just don't, once again, think we should be blamed for a really larger problem than here. We can do all the things, and I don't think we're gonna stop the behavior this year. We should look for long-term, I think, like ways that our system is responding. And I'm worried about the short-term promises, I think would be hard to do, hard to make.
So I think what I heard, and I'll make a note on the work plan for posterity, that sometime in March, April, to revisit what should go on the agenda for the board, and also that we'll be hearing more about panorama and transferable skills. Thank you for the conversation, folks. Appreciate it.
One of the resources you might want to consider is the Hewlett Foundation. I don't know if you've had any work with them at all, but in the last 3 years, they've done several $1 million in exactly what you're talking about, and engaging the community and the schools as a whole and looking at equity and diversion.
Thank you. Okey doke. All right, so we have links to some committee updates. Facilities. Does anybody have any questions, comments? Does that committee want to speak to that at all?
Well, briefly, we had a couple topics. Excuse me. We co-met with the finance committee and talked about the budget and the purchase of central office, and came away with some understandings that have changed. And then amongst us kids, and we talked a little bit about the state facilities assessment and what the value was there. There's not a lot of noodling on that. It's more of a Vermont state level document for consideration, and that kind of folded with the Truax Collins activity to do a more specific analysis of space. We also talked about for a future meeting to revisit a little bit about what the function of the facilities subcommittee could be, should be, might be. So that's on the table.
Sort of visiting the charge.
Yeah, revisiting the charge, looking to see what other boards are doing, both within the realm of policy governance and probably outside of policy governance, as well as a board function. And then the other thing is, do we need to really meet every month? Because
Yeah.
It's just drawn out work, so,
I think that, I meant to, I don't know if I included this in the chair note, but you reminded me that it would be good for the board to have a conversation about, whether some committees are ad hoc that generate based around a particular need, like a bond, or if you, you know, have a sunset because your particular focus is done. Because there is no point in meeting just to meet, and there are other places you could be deployed. So,
boy, no,
well, not you, my friend, though, because you also are,
Procedures.
counting them down.
Not.
but anyway, so it is something I think to think about. But yeah, not right now. Okay,
That's
anything on finance? I think you guys have your work cut out for you. You want to add anything to what you're?
I think you've got a pretty
Liquid.
good insight into what we've been doing.
Yes.
Just being spun around and around.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
at some point, we will pick our heads up and sort of think more broadly about finance committees day to day,
Mhm.
apart from budget, because I feel like that everything else has been pushed
Yeah.
as we think about this. And so trying to get a plan, you know, year over year that we can have space for the budget, plus the other sort of roles that have been sort of tasked with,
Mhm.
I think is kind of one of the goals that we'll have.
And I think we will meet at our regular time, right?
Yeah, I think we will definitely consider what our steps are and actually get
And what our communication plan is
exactly.
going to be at that point.
There could be a whole lot of new information.
Exactly.
do you all, if you haven't yet had a chance to open up the Vermont School Board Association weekly thingy email, there is a link sort of down the bottom to the Champlain Valley School District Budget Communications Tool. Anyway, it's sort of a calendar, and just in terms of thinking about how to chunk your work over the course of a year. And I think, you know, all of our committees are doing a little bit of, like, there was a lot of pent up need, and now, and, you know, and I think then they'll become hopefully a more sustainable flow of work that once we get through this first year. But anyway, that might be something to look at as a model calendar to follow.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks.
P and G.
Yes, we're continuing to work through a re-review of all the policies. Sort of forget what percentage we're through at the moment, but the goal was kind of see if we could get, before we have a reorganizational meeting, at least through a first pass, through all the ones we currently have, to see if there's anything glaring that needs to be updated, because they're all, if you haven't seen the policies yet, there's a handful of them that are currently still in Patrick's lap to look at. But they're all pretty out of date. They were created in 2018, and some of them haven't been used since then. So we're still working through that. If you look at our minutes, just looking at maybe some tweaks to the director's policy, which sets the contracts for unionized employees.
Oh, it's
You'll probably see sometime
They're both the.
in the spring. Looking at different ways to augment the superintendent evaluation process that we're using right now, just to make it a little more robust. Looking at with the CEC committee on putting together a protocol for public participation to be more responsive to public comment, and getting that dovetailed in with a protocol for running the meetings, which we really currently don't have. And also working on maybe some better tools for people to respond to the monitoring reports.
Mhm.
So it's a little easier for folks to like open up maybe a digital format response, where you can click a couple of buttons and give the board chair, you know, a search, sort of a filled out survey of what everybody's feelings were before we get into the meeting. And there are a couple of issues that are sort of been put on the back burner here. We started looking at the school choice policy. And we need to have an agenda item on the full board to talk about, you know, the limitations of what we can do with school choice in terms of transportation and whether or not that's gonna drive, you know, whether we're gonna wanna embark on more effort in that direction or whether we're gonna take a different tact on that. And ends policy and monitoring, we keep bringing this up when we talk about things that we either don't like or do like about the ends policy or monitoring report. We need a little more feedback from the board based on things we've heard recently about whether or not there's any appetite for modifying the policy itself or its monitoring and the interpretations that are in the monitoring process right now. So nothing really going on.
Not busy at all.
They're gonna meet every day.
Every day. And if you're not on the facilities committee anymore, maybe you can help them.
I've had that same reaction, like there's another email from Steve talking about
Yes.
how they're doing nothing in P&G.
I don't know if we're glad you retired.
You did?
Oh, goodness. Okay, community engagement committee, you can see our minutes.
Mhm.
We are cruising along. And we have some data, feedback for you guys on your public participation protocol.
Yes. We've received that.
Okay. So folks, we do have an executive session that we need to move to go into. And I'm thinking since it's 9:22 and we haven't moved at all since we got here, we should probably take a 5-minute bio break before we do. And then we can adjourn after. So maybe let's do our meeting evaluation first. And then we'll have a motion to go into executive session.
Trying to do public comment before.
Oh,
executive
yes.
session, too.
Let's public comment now. I do not see anybody, so meeting evaluation, can somebody click the link and walk us through that? Looking at my vice chair, could you do that for us, friend?
Totally. I was
Thank
kind
you.
of hoping someone else might. Give me a second.
You just do such a good job.
It's a really tough gig, I'll tell you. Um,
Because we have to have some reason to give you more.
You have to earn your keep.
everybody take note, because whoever's next in line. Why am I not seeing it on top of the
At the bottom.
It's at the bottom.
oh, golly gee? Got it.
But you're in the-
Sorry. It's loading.
Well, I have to note, there is another self-assessment tool that the VSBA has put out that we're gonna be eventually putting out for consideration.
Level of engagement of all board members, high or low?
Hi.
Was the agenda followed? Yes.
Yes.
With some amendments.
Full amendments, yeah.
Couple amendments, yeah.
Does the chair effectively establish the agenda and materials for distribution to the board?
Yes.
Yes.
Is the chair effective in fostering a professional culture regarding fair and open deliberation, full participation of all members, and ensuring the integrity of board process?
Absolutely.
Any other feedback for the chair?
Nice job with your presentation.
Thank you.
Good job all year long.
Yeah, thank you.
There.
That would have been an opportunity to say, please don't go.
I've already tried.
Oh, you
Hasn't
tried it,
worked.
okay, yeah.
Yeah, you got
It doesn't have to be.
You'd have to get through Hannah, Isabel, Sam, and Brendan first.
Oh, I'm ready.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can vote somebody other than a board member to be the chair.
Is that it?
What went well with the meeting?
In a budget,
Yes.
it's well, but
It went.
it went.
Well, that happened.
I thought it was a really thorough discussion, actually.
It was
Yes,
good.
there was
Yeah,
great.
well, very good.
Nice, given the complexity of it, to
Yeah.
allow us all to wrap our heads around, so.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
And then any other suggestions for future meetings? Okay. Awesome.
Okay. So should we move first and then go?
We can move to go into executive session, and
Okay.
people start their clear out process, and then we can just keep moving.
All right, so need a motion to go into executive session, Title I, VSA 5, Section 313A3. Evaluation of an employee superintendent performance check-in.
So moved.
Kristen, and a second?
I'll second.
Second.
There, I got it. Or she was louder. Okay.
Time.
Um,
I'm tired.
so just to clarify, we're going to go in, we will disinvite anyone that's on the Zoom that shouldn't be on the Zoom. We'll keep that one open, but we're gonna take a 5-minute bio break. And we will be just coming out to adjourn. We won't be taking any action. All those in favor of the motion to go into executive session, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, see you in 5.